From an early age, we're told what it means to live well, achieve success, follow rules, believe what everyone believes, smile even when everything inside is screaming. We're shaped to fit into patterns, programmed to follow a script we never wrote. But there comes a moment when something inside of us starts to stir, a strange feeling, a quiet discomfort. Is this all there is? Is this life truly mine? This question is not a weakness, it's awakening. It's the beginning of a dangerous, lonely journey, but one that is absolutely necessary. The journey of someone who starts thinking for themselves, someone who dares to confront the absurd, the emptiness, the fear, and still keeps moving forward. Existentialist philosophers didn't come to offer comfort. They came to show us the raw truth of existence, that to live is to carry anguish, that being free is scary, and that finding meaning isn't about discovering, it's about creating. In this video, you'll learn 28 existentialist philosophical ideas that will shake your certainties, tear apart your comfort zones, and force you to look within. These are not easy truths, but they might be exactly what you need to begin truly living, for yourself, not for others. If you feel something's missing, if you're tired of masks, empty routines, and lies disguised as normality, this video is for you. Get ready. The answers aren't simple, but the dive is worth it. The phrase, "become who you are," appears in Nietzsche, especially in Ecce Homo, but the principle it expresses runs through all his work. This maxim carries an essential tension in his philosophy. It's not about discovering a hidden essence within oneself, but about affirming an active and continuous process of self-construction. For Nietzsche, the human being is not something given, but something to be achieved through the struggle against the leveling forces of morality, culture, and even psychological inertia. To understand this idea, it is necessary to reject the notion of a fixed identity, something preformed waiting to be revealed. Unlike the Socratic or Christian tradition, Nietzsche denies that there is a true self hidden behind appearances. Instead, he proposes that the individual must create themselves, not according to a universal ideal, but from their own singularity, from their tragic and finite position in the world. Nietzsche views life as a work of art, and the human being as the sculptor of themselves. In The Gay Science, he states that the greatest challenge is to give style to one's character. This does not mean masking oneself or conforming to external expectations, but organizing one's internal forces in an affirmative, creative, and vital manner. This process involves aesthetic discipline, a rigorous selection of what is incorporated into one's life, and radical courage in the face of chaos. Identity, then, is a task. The individual is not born with it, but must build it through the will to power. A central concept in Nietzsche, which does not refer to domination over others, but to the ability to assert oneself amid the instability of the world. Becoming who you are is, in this sense, a continuous exercise in intensifying life, transforming pain into strength and limitation into form. This project is inseparable from the battle against the morality of the herd, one of Nietzsche's main critiques. In works like On the Genealogy of Morals and Beyond Good and Evil, he exposes how Judeo-Christian morality promoted the denial of life, favoring values like humility, obedience, and guilt. This morality imposes an ideal model to follow, suffocating the difference and singular power of each individual. Saying, "become who you are," in this context, is to reject imposed values and take the risk of creating new values, one's own values. This implies a process of self-overcoming, Selbstüberwindung, a term Nietzsche uses to designate the way the individual must constantly break with their previous forms, never settling into any fixed identity. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, this idea is dramatized in the sequence of the three metamorphoses of the spirit: the camel, which carries the burden of inherited values, the lion, which denies and destroys those values, and the child, who represents the creation of new, spontaneous, affirmative, free values. The path to becoming who you are requires going through these phases: enduring, denying, and finally, creating. This process is individual and non-transferable. There is no model to follow, for each person carries within them a unique combination of forces, circumstances, and possibilities. For Nietzsche, greatness lies in living in such a way that one can say, "Thus I willed," that is, affirming one's own life as the work of one's own will. He himself, in Ecce Homo, interprets the maxim, "Become who you are," as the expression of a fully affirmed destiny, where nothing is refused or reneged. This total affirmation of existence connects to the concept of amor fati, love of fate. Instead of wishing that life were different, the individual affirms everything that was necessary for them to become what they are. The pain, the failures, the humiliations, all are integrated as part of the process. Becoming who you are does not mean freeing yourself from suffering, but transforming it into a creative force. Nietzsche saw this as the opposite of resentment, a feeling characteristic of the morality of the weak, who blame the world for their unhappiness. The person who becomes who they are does not blame, does not apologize for existing, and does not seek approval from others. They live according to their own measure and take responsibility for everything that they are. Therefore, become who you are is not an invitation to narcissism or naive self-expression. It is an ethical and aesthetic challenge to take on the difficult task of living true to oneself, even if that requires confronting everything that is comfortable, inherited, or socially accepted. Nietzsche proposes a fidelity to oneself that can only be achieved through suffering, discipline, and creation, not by revelation but by affirmation. Identity for Nietzsche is a field of forces, and becoming oneself is about organizing these forces toward the maximum vital power. It's about living in such a way that one could want to relive that same life eternally, as the experiment of the eternal return suggests. A life so affirmative that one would want to repeat it endlessly, exactly as it was. This demand is the peak of his philosophy. Becoming who you are means becoming worthy of the eternal return. That is, living in such a way that your own existence is justifiable in itself, without appeal to any external salvation, without the promise of reward, without metaphysical redemption. Just life, intensely lived, consciously assumed, artistically shaped. The phrase, "hell is other people," spoken by one of the characters in the play Huis Clos, 1944, sums up a central aspect of Jean-Paul Sartre's ontology: otherness as a field of existential tension. Far from being a rejection of others or an expression of vulgar individualism, it reveals a structural problem of the human condition: the way the presence of others interferes in the constitution of the self. Sartre's philosophy begins with a fundamental distinction between two modes of being in itself, en soi, which characterizes objects, closed, determined, without consciousness, and being for itself, pour soi, which is human consciousness, open, empty, pure freedom. Consciousness is not a thing among things. It is nothing in itself, and it is this emptiness that makes it free, capable of projecting itself, denying itself, not coinciding with what it is. But being for itself, though free, is not solipsistic. It exists in the world, and that world includes other beings for itself. The presence of the other is not just an addition to my existence, it profoundly transforms it. It is at this intersection of consciousnesses that the central conflict Sartre explores in Being and Nothingness, 1943, emerges. The other has the power to turn me into an object, to see me from the outside and attribute a meaning to me that I cannot control. The experience of the other's gaze is the turning point. When I realize that I am being observed, I don't just realize that someone is looking at me. I realize that I am seen as something, that I am captured in a meaning that is no longer under my sovereignty. This experience is constitutive of shame. I don't feel ashamed in front of myself, but in front of the implicit judgment in the other's gaze. At that moment, I cease to be pure project and become what the other sees in me. This objectification is inevitable in human coexistence. Even when there is no explicit intention to judge, the mere presence of another conscious being already turns me into an object that can be interpreted. Sartre states that the other is the one who looks at me and makes me be what I am not, too, myself. He takes me away from myself. My being then becomes for the other, and not just for me. The phrase, hell is other people, arises precisely in this ontological context. In Huis Clos, 3 characters are condemned to remain together forever in a closed room. There is no physical torture, but as the interaction develops, it becomes clear that the true torment is the constant and inescapable presence of the other. Each character tries to escape the judgment of the other, but all are trapped in this game of mirrors, where they only see themselves through the eyes of each other. The character Garcin, for example, wants to be recognized as brave, but Inès insists on seeing him as cowardly. Estelle seeks to be desired and admired, but Inès accuses her of superficiality. Inès, in turn, tries to emotionally manipulate others to be desired, but encounters Garcin's resistance. What is revealed is a vicious circle. Each depends on the other to validate their own identity, but this validation never fully materializes. This situation illustrates Sartre's thesis that human freedom is always in tension with the freedom of others. We are free, but this freedom clashes with the freedom of others, who are also trying to assert themselves. The other, by looking at me, exerts power over me. They delimit, define, label. And even if I rebel against this, I cannot prevent them from seeing me. That's why the presence of the other is inevitably a form of limitation. In Sartre's vocabulary, this is expressed through the opposition between being for itself, consciousness as a project, and being for the other, consciousness as an object for the other's consciousness. The problem arises because both coexist simultaneously, and I cannot escape from either. While I am freedom and the creation of myself, I am also captured by external representations by which I can be reduced, judged, and classified. This condition leads to the phenomenon of bad faith, mauvaise foi, where the individual tries to escape their freedom by hiding behind social roles or fixed identities. Often, bad faith is sustained by the internalization of the other's gaze. The subject believes they are what the other sees, and in doing so, gives up their own freedom to project themselves differently. The subject in bad faith accepts being an object among objects, a thing among things, as a way of avoiding the anxiety of total freedom. At the same time, Sartre does not propose an escape from coexistence. He does not suggest that the solution lies in solitude or self-sufficiency. On the contrary, the other is a structural condition of human existence. Otherness is inevitable. What he condemns is the illusion that the other could, at some point, authentically recognize me without reducing me. This expectation, for him, is doomed to failure. The relationship with the other, therefore, is marked by a fundamental ambiguity. On the one hand, I need the other to constitute my own identity. Without otherness, there is no self-consciousness. On the other hand, the presence of the other never recognizes me as I would like to be recognized. There will always be a mismatch between what I am to myself and what I am to the other. And it is precisely this mismatch that generates conflict, resentment, and alienation. At the deepest level of Sartre's analysis, hell is other people is not just a critique of coexistence, but a statement about the tragic condition of human freedom. We are condemned to freedom, as he writes in Being and Nothingness, but this freedom takes place in a world where all others are also free, and the freedom of the other interferes, limits, and challenges mine. This friction is not an accident, but the very structure of existence between consciousnesses. It is not joy nor fulfillment that marks the rhythm of existence for Arthur Schopenhauer. What gives life its pace is frustration. For him, the structure of human experience is essentially negative. We are born to suffer, and when we are not suffering, we are bored. The phrase "life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom" reveals, with cruel precision, the relentless dynamics of our condition. This movement is not accidental, but necessary. It stems from the very essence of reality, as Schopenhauer conceives it, an irrational expression of desire that is never satisfied. At the heart of Schopenhauer's philosophy is the distinction between the world as representation and the world as will. What we perceive, phenomena, objects, events, is the world as it appears to human consciousness, structured by the forms of space, time, and causality. But behind this, there exists a deeper reality that is beyond conceptual thought, the world as will. This will is not rational, moral, or ordered, or it is a blind impulse of affirmation, a metaphysical force that manifests at all levels of being. The human being in this scheme is the most complex and conscious form of this will, but because of this, it is also the most tormented. The will expresses itself in us as constant desire. We want, we long, we seek. And while we want, we suffer. Pain, therefore, is not an exception in human life, but its permanent condition. Desire never runs out. Even when a desire is satisfied, the satisfaction is only momentary. Another soon emerges, and the chain continues. Pleasure, for Schopenhauer, has no substance of its own. It is merely the temporary interruption of the pain of unfulfilled desire. The experience of pleasure is, therefore, always fleeting and negative, not something in itself, but the relief of tension. When hunger is satisfied, pleasure is experienced, but only because the pain has been suspended. And as soon as satisfaction passes, restlessness, need, and the impulse to desire something else return. The cycle never ends. Between these moments of pain and fleeting pleasure, boredom arises. Boredom appears when nothing is immediately lacking, but also nothing satisfies us. It is the conscious awareness of the emptiness of existence when we are not pressed by urgent needs. And it is precisely here that Schopenhauer sees one of the deepest forms of suffering, not the pain that comes from lack, but the suffering that emerges from the emptiness of meaning. Boredom is not just a pause. It is a subtle unrest that reveals the absurdity of existence. This oscillation between pain and boredom is the pendulum that shapes the experience of lived time. And since the will is tireless, this movement is endless. The tragic structure of life is that everything we desire disappoints us as soon as it is achieved, and everything we lack oppresses us as it is desired. There is no true rest. There is no state of balance. For Schopenhauer, the problem is not in the external world, but in the very nature of wanting. The will is, by essence, lack, and all lack is suffering. There is no object capable of permanently satisfying the will because its essence is movement, not rest. Human desire is, by definition, insatiable, and the more developed consciousness is, the more intense the perception of this futile cycle becomes. Animals suffer less than humans because they do not project themselves into time. They do not anticipate the future. They do not reflect on the uselessness of existence. The intelligence that distinguishes us is also what condemns us to the deepest pain. Boredom, in this sense, is a tragic privilege of consciousness. It arises when all basic needs are satisfied, when there is no physical pain, no scarcity, yet we still feel something is missing. What we lack, in fact, is a purpose. Since existence has no given meaning, boredom is the confrontation with this absence. It reveals that even when everything is fine, life can be unbearable. Boredom exposes the failure of pleasure as a solution and lays bare the emptiness of ordinary experience. This view extends to Schopenhauer's critique of social life, the pursuit of status, wealth, and recognition. For him, all these goals are illusions that keep the individual bound to the will. The one who becomes rich, for example, soon discovers that possessing wealth does not bring peace. Then boredom arises, followed by new desires, more comfort, more prestige, more novelty. The restlessness persists. Restlessness is the will in action. At the core, there is no end to wanting, and this is why Schopenhauer believes the only possible relief lies in the denial of the will. This denial does not come through rational effort or moral repression, but through a gradual emptying of desire, achieved through specific paths. Among them, he highlights three: art, compassion, and asceticism. Art, especially music, has the power to momentarily suspend the will. By contemplating a work of art disinterestedly, that is, without wanting to possess it, without seeking utilitarian pleasure, the individual rises above their condition as a desiring being and experiences a moment of stillness. Music, because it is a direct expression of the will without concept, can also produce this effect. It echoes the movement of the will, but without binding us to concrete objects of desire. Compassion is another path, as it breaks with the natural selfishness of the will. When we suffer with the suffering of another, the center of our own will is moved beyond the self. This movement, though brief, weakens the blind affirmation of the will and opens space for a deeper ethical perception. Finally, Schopenhauer sees asceticism, the voluntary renunciation of desires and pleasures, as the most radical form of the denial of the will. Inspired by Buddhism and mystical Christianity, he describes the ascetic as one who breaks the pendulum cycle, who refuses the game of pain and boredom, and seeks a type of peace that is not found in the phenomenal world. It is a difficult path, often misunderstood, but he considers it the only genuinely liberating one. If these reflections are awakening something in you, questions, curiosity, or even productive discomfort, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. Saying that humans are condemned to be free puts the core of Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialist thought in its rawest and most demanding form. This phrase appears in Being and Nothingness, 1943, and was popularized by him in later lectures, such as Existentialism is a Humanism, 1945. What it expresses is not a privilege or a power to be celebrated, but an inevitable and, at the same time, anguishing ontological condition. For Sartre, freedom is not a choice, it is what you are. Freedom does not appear as an optional property of being human, but as the very structure of consciousness. Human existence is defined by its openness to the world, by the fact that it is always a project, a denial, an overcoming of what already is. Sartre calls this being for itself, the consciousness that refuses to coincide with itself, that is always surpassing any fixed identity. Unlike things, which simply are what they are, being in itself, the human being is what it is not, and is not what it is. This means that a person is never ready or complete. They are constantly in motion, constantly building themselves, and this construction is the work of their freedom. There is no given human essence, neither by God, nature, nor society. Existence precedes essence. First, humans exist, appear in the world, and then define themselves through their actions. Every choice is an act of self-definition. But this freedom is not liberating in the conventional sense. It is a condemnation, because we cannot stop choosing. Even inaction is a choice. Even refusing to act is an act for which we take responsibility. There is no outside of freedom. Human beings are thrown into the world without transcendent justification, without a pre-written script, and are forced to invent themselves from nothing. It is at this point that Sartre introduces the notion of total responsibility. If we are free, we are also absolutely responsible for everything we do, and moreover, for everything we are. There are no ontological excuses. We cannot attribute our way of being to a human nature, destiny, or an unconscious force outside our control. Sartre rejects all forms of determinism. What we make of ourselves, including what we allow others to make of us, is our responsibility. This idea deeply challenges common sense, which tends to look for justifications for our failures and limitations in external causes: education, family, society, biology. Sartre does not deny the existence of these conditions. He acknowledges that humans are thrown into the world with a body, within a culture, at a specific time. But what he asserts is that none of these conditions defines us absolutely. We are responsible for how we react to them, how we accept or reject them, how we incorporate or overcome them. Freedom is the margin that always remains, and that margin is never zero. Thus, freedom is not synonymous with being able to do whatever you want without consequences. It is, on the contrary, a burden. It is the demand to take a stand, to choose, even in doubt, even in anguish, even without guarantees. And here comes another essential concept in Sartre's philosophy: anguish. When we realize that we are radically free, we are overcome with a feeling of vertigo. Anguish is the experience of pure freedom, of the absence of foundations. There are no fixed values, no eternal truths, no manuals. There is only the act of choosing, and with it, the responsibility of sustaining the consequences for oneself and for the world. Sartre gives the example of a young man torn between staying with his sick mother or joining the French resistance during the Nazi occupation. There is no right answer. There is no absolute principle telling him what to do. The young man is alone with the choice, and what he decides will, at the same time, be a judgment about what he values most. He will invent the value of his action by performing it. To choose is always to choose oneself. But there is a common reaction to this radical freedom: bad faith, mauvaise foi. Sartre describes bad faith as a form of self-deception in which the individual tries to escape their freedom by pretending to be just an object, a role, a function, a conditioned being. The classic example is the waiter who acts as a real waiter, exaggerating his gestures and attitudes, as if his identity were entirely contained within this role. He acts as if he is not free, as if being a waiter completely defines him. Bad faith manifests when the subject refuses to recognize their responsibility. When someone says, "I had no choice. It's my nature. I'm like this because I was raised this way." They are avoiding confrontation with their freedom. They are trying to be a being in itself, a thing, instead of assuming their condition as being for itself. But for Sartre, this self-deception is always conscious to some degree. Bad faith requires the consciousness to split. It knows it is free, but pretends it is not. The condemnation to freedom is, therefore, a condemnation to responsibility, not just for what we do, but for who we are and what the world becomes through our actions. This implies that each human being, when choosing, chooses not only for themselves, but for all of humanity. Our actions project an image of what we consider desirable, of what we think a human being should be. Thus, existentialism is not nihilism. It is an ethics, but an ethics without external foundations, built from the concrete situation and individual responsibility. This weight, far from being theoretical, translates into the practical reality of our most everyday choices. By choosing to be silent or to speak, to submit or resist, to commit or to omit, the subject is always shaping themselves. There is no neutrality. Even conformism is a form of choice. That is why Sartre says that a person is what they make of themselves, not just in the sense of personal construction, but in the sense that each action reveals and constitutes who they are. Freedom, thus, is a fact, and not a privilege. To be condemned to freedom means that, whether we like it or not, we are the authors of our own lives. Existence does not come with ready-made justifications. There is no essence to fulfill. There is only what we make of what we are in the present moment. The phrase, "He who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakens," expresses one of the central ideas of Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology. True transformation does not come from adapting to the external world, but from diving into the inner reality, a dark, ambiguous, archetypal, and often disturbing territory. For Jung, the path of individuation, the process of becoming truly oneself, requires an introspective journey that inevitably confronts us with what he called the shadow, the repressed or denied aspect of the psyche. The outward vision symbolizes directing consciousness toward the objective world, social conventions, professional roles, cultural norms, and the judgments of others. This vision is necessary for survival and the formation of the ego, but it is insufficient for self-knowledge. It keeps us in touch with shared reality, but often distances us from the core of our psychic life. According to Jung, most people live based on external images projected onto them by society and culture, and thus remain alienated from themselves. The metaphor of dreaming represents this state of existential unconsciousness. Looking outside and identifying solely with what is visible and measurable is, for Jung, a way of living in a symbolic world that is not truly ours. It is an identification with the persona, the aspect of the psyche shaped to interact with the world, but when confused with the true self, it generates falsehood and imbalance. The persona, though necessary, is a mask. When the individual believes they are only this mask, they live asleep, dreaming the life others expect from them, not the one pulsating within their soul. Looking inward, by contrast, means turning attention to what is outside of conscious control. Hidden desires, repressed impulses, traumas, recurring symbols in dreams, emotional complexes, internal contradictions. This is a movement that requires courage as it confronts the ego with its limitations. Awakening, then, is not pleasant or inspiring at first. It is destabilizing. Self-knowledge, for Jung, is a form of necessary suffering, as it shatters comforting illusions. Throughout his work, Jung shows that the unconscious is not just a repository of repressed content, as Freud suggested, but a dynamic and structured system governed by symbolic and universal forces. These forces manifest through archetypes, primordial patterns of experience that structure the human psyche and express themselves in myths, religions, fairy tales, art, and dreams. The psyche, when looking inward, encounters these images, which are not products of individual culture, but the heritage of all humanity, the collective unconscious. But the encounter with the unconscious is not a harmonious integration from the start. It first requires facing the shadow, the archetype that represents all aspects of the self that have been rejected, ignored, or despised. The shadow includes moral, emotional, instinctual, or intellectual traits that the ego refuses to recognize as its own. By denying these parts, the subject projects the shadow onto others, seeing in others the flaws they refuse to admit in themselves. This is the importance of introspection. Only by facing the shadow, recognizing it, can the process of individuation begin. The encounter with the shadow is a critical moment. It is not merely therapeutic, but symbolic and transformative. Jung shows that many psychological breakdowns come from the resistance to contact with the dark content of the soul. The shadow is dangerous precisely because it is ignored. It operates behind conscious behavior, manipulates reactions, distorts relationships, and sabotages projects. The individual who does not recognize their own shadow lives in permanent conflict with the world as they project outward what they refuse to accept in themselves. Looking inward, therefore, is an act of ontological responsibility. It implies recognizing that the psyche is not transparent, that the self is not the master of itself, that consciousness is limited. Jung rejects the modern ideal of the rational, autonomous subject and replaces this image with a living psyche, autonomous in its deeper layers, which requires symbolic listening and not rational control. Dreams play an essential role in this process. For Jung, dreams are communications from the unconscious to the conscious mind, symbolic messages that guide, challenge, correct, or alert the ego. Interpreting them is not a mechanical task, but a dialogue with the language of myth. The psyche speaks in images, and those who look inward must learn to read these images without reducing them to scientific schemes or psychological formulas. The symbolic language of the soul is ambiguous, paradoxical, and multi-meaning. By opening up to this listening, the subject begins the process of individuation, the movement by which a human being differentiates themselves from their collective identifications and gradually becomes what they are in potential. Individuation is not the same as selfishness or self-realization in the sense of modern personal development. For Jung, it is about becoming whole, that is, integrating the opposites of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and shadow. The awakening Jung speaks of is the overcoming of one-sidedness. Ordinary consciousness, focused outward, tends toward rigidity, the repetition of social patterns, and the repression of internal conflicts. Awakening is the opposite movement, a return to the deepest psychic center, the self, which is not the ego, but the organizing principle of the totality of the personality. The self appears in dreams and myths through symbolic figures: the wise old man, the divine child, the circle, the mandala. These symbols point to a totality not yet realized, but latent. This process offers no guarantees. It requires traversing the inner chaos, enduring the fragmentation of the ego, going through an identity crisis. Jung describes these phases as dark nights of the soul, similar to those described in mystical traditions. The path inward is a descent into the underworld, like the journeys of Ulysses, Orpheus, and Dante. And as with every mythical descent, the return is only possible after confronting internal monsters. The phrase, "He who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakens," thus summarizes a model of psychic transformation that demands shifting the center of life from the surface to the interior, from adaptation to authenticity, from the social mask to the symbolic reality. Awakening is not a sudden illumination, but the slow and arduous work of integrating the forgotten parts of oneself and self. In The Myth of Sisyphus, published in 1942, Albert Camus presents one of the most emblematic images in contemporary philosophy: the man who eternally pushes a boulder up a mountain, only to see it roll back down to the starting point. This man is Sisyphus, a figure from Greek mythology condemned by the gods to repeat this endless task. What Camus proposes, in a surprising and paradoxical way, is that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. The final sentence of the work is not ironic or escapist. It is the conclusion of a deep investigation into the relationship between humans and the absurd. Camus begins with a fundamental realization: the world is silent in the face of human questions. The desire for meaning, order, and ultimate reason collides with an indifferent, chaotic, and mute reality. Humans are thrown into a universe that does not respond to their call for meaning. This clash between the longing for significance and the absence of an answer is what Camus calls the absurd. The absurd is neither the world by itself nor the human by itself, but the confrontation between the two. It is a relational result. It arises when an awakened consciousness encounters the irrationality of reality. The absurd arises from this confrontation between human demand and the irrational silence of the world, writes Camus. Faced with this condition, one question inevitably arises: if life has no meaning, is it still worth living? Camus refuses to turn to transcendental answers. He rejects both religious faith and philosophical systems that attempt to restore a metaphysical meaning to existence. For him, any attempt to escape the absurd, whether through faith in God, absolute reason, or the hope of future redemption, is a philosophical suicide. It is to renounce clarity in favor of a comforting illusion. The only legitimate response to the absurd, according to Camus, is conscious acceptance. And this is where Sisyphus comes in. Sisyphus is, for Camus, the symbol of the absurd man. He knows the extent of his condemnation. He understands that his task is useless, endless, without purpose. And yet, he continues, not out of hope nor ignorance, but out of clarity. By embracing the repetition of his task without appealing to transcendent meaning, Sisyphus embodies the dignity of someone who fully lives their condition. He is the model of one who, even knowing the meaninglessness, does not shrink from life. The most important moment in Sisyphus's story, according to Camus, is not the act of pushing the boulder, but the descent from the mountain, when the hero walks back to the base in silence, preparing to start over. It is at this moment that he becomes aware of his condition, and it is in this awareness that his freedom lies. The boulder continues to fall, but he is no longer a slave to an illusion. He is the master of his task because he understands it in its entirety. The struggle toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart, says Camus. This struggle, as absurd as it may seem, is the affirmation of life without appeal. It is what Camus calls revolt. Not a violent revolt, but an existential revolt, the refusal to surrender to despair or to metaphysical consolation. Revolting is affirming life, as it is, without promises, without redemption, without an external purpose. It is refusing to die for an illusory truth. Revolt is the mode of being for the lucid person in the face of the absurd. In this sense, imagining Sisyphus happy is not an exercise in trivial optimism. It is an ethical and ontological stance. Sisyphus's happiness is not that of someone who ignores their condition, but of someone who fully accepts it. Joy, for Camus, is not fleeting euphoria, but the state of one who, having lost all illusions, still chooses to live. The absurd is not an end, it is a starting point. Camus rejects both nihilism and metaphysical consolation. He seeks a middle path, a conscious, intense, present way of living. The absurd man is one who, knowing that everything will pass, still engages, loves, and acts. That is why Sisyphus's boulder, as heavy as it is, becomes the symbol of authentic existence. The boulder is not eliminated, but is carried with dignity, and this dignity does not come from the result, but from the attitude. The lesson we draw from this image is profoundly practical. Even the most repetitive work, the most mundane tasks, the driest routines can be lived fully, if they are faced with consciousness. The key lies in how we relate to the real, not in expecting the real to transform into something it is not. The meaning, if there is any, is not in the world, but in the way we confront it. Camus expands on this view throughout his work, associating the absurd condition with art, passion, political action, and solidarity. But all these developments stem from the same point: the lucid acceptance of the absurd as the human condition. Living without meaning is not living in despair, but living without appeal, without seeking to justify existence by something outside of itself. It is living, life as its own end. Therefore, Sisyphus is a hero. Not a triumphant hero, but a tragic one. His greatness does not lie in defeating the gods, but in not submitting to them. He transforms punishment into an act of resistance. Repetition does not nullify him, it strengthens him. The falling boulder is the same, but the man who carries it each time is more aware of himself. Camus invites us to see him as a symbol of ourselves, of our daily struggle, of our actions that seem useless, but that, if faced with lucidity, can carry all the nobility of a life fully lived. The image of the abyss appears in one of the most dense and provocative passages of Friedrich Nietzsche, in aphorism 146 of Beyond Good and Evil. The original quote says, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you." This philosophical warning is both an existential metaphor and a psychological analysis of the risk involved in the search for truth, justice, and deep meaning. In the paraphrase, "You are the abyss looking back," the emphasis shifts to the subject's identity. It's no longer just about the abyss looking at you, but you yourself becoming the abyss. This version intensifies Nietzsche's thought by highlighting the deep impact that facing chaos, evil, or the unknown can have on the person confronting it. Exploring chaos transforms us, and in some cases, devours us. Nietzsche wrote Beyond, Good and Evil as a critique of the dogmatic philosophies of morality, truth, and metaphysics. His project was to unmask the unexamined assumptions of Western tradition, exposing the impulses of power, resentment, and self-deception behind the pretense of objectivity and moral purity. In the aphorism about the abyss, he presents a warning. The obsessive quest to unmask evil, confront error, or denounce injustice can deform the one who engages in it. The line that separates the hero from the monster, the philosopher from the fanatic, the critic from the destroyer, is thin, and it is often crossed without being noticed. The first part of the phrase, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster, already carries a tragic tension. The fight against evil is not morally neutral. When we face what we consider monstrous, we risk adopting the same means, strategies, or mental structures of the one we condemn. What began as resistance can turn into repetition. The courage to look at the worst of reality can transmute into cynicism, brutality, or self-destruction. Nietzsche does not suggest a retreat from conflict or a relativistic indifference. On the contrary, he recognizes the need to fight, to investigate, to transgress. But he insists on the necessity of inner vigilance. The danger is not only in what we face, but in what the struggle awakens within us. It is a warning against the triumph of the shadow inside the ethical agent. The image of the abyss amplifies this tension. The abyss is Nietzsche's symbol of the bottomless infinite, of chaos, of formlessness, of raw truth, stripped of comforting illusions. Looking into the abyss is contemplating what is beyond order, the primordial chaos, the absence of meaning, existential helplessness. It is the moment when the veil of consoling narratives is torn and reality reveals itself in its radical brutality. But this gaze is not one-sided. The abyss also looks back. This means that the object of contemplation affects us, modifies us, penetrates us. The process of knowing in Nietzsche is never purely rational or detached. There is no neutrality of the subject in relation to the object. When contemplating chaos, evil, the absurd, or the very inner self stripped bare, the subject becomes involved, transformed, contaminated by what they contemplate. The boundary between the observer and the observed dissolves. This is why Nietzsche develops a philosophical psychology based on the danger of self-knowledge. It is not about avoiding clarity, but recognizing that truth has a price. Those who dive into symbolic depths risk losing their form, structure, and center. The philosopher, the psychologist, the artist, the moral warrior, all who descend into the underworld of the soul or history must know that it is not always possible to return intact. In this sense, the abyss also represents the Jungian shadow, avant la lettre, that which was repressed, denied, or forgotten, but returns with force. Looking inward, diving into one's own interiority, does not guarantee illumination. It may bring forth violence, resentment, guilt, destruction. Gazing too long into the abyss is also risking being fascinated by it, finding in it an amoral freedom, a vertigo that dissolves the boundaries between good and evil. Nietzsche does not write to prevent this dive, but to affirm the necessity of doing so with clarity and inner strength. His philosophy is marked by the ideal of transvaluation, the overcoming of inherited values, the affirmation of life as it is, with its darkest aspects. But this overcoming cannot be done naively. Transformation requires a subject capable of bearing the weight of what they see. The contemplation of the abyss requires a strengthened will, a psychological structure that does not crumble in the face of what it discovers. That is why Nietzsche insists on the concept of great health. The philosopher must be someone with a strong stomach, someone who not only endures the truth, but transforms it into creative power. The risk is constant. The abyss can devour, but it can also forge. It is at this threshold that Nietzsche locates the danger and greatness of authentic philosophical thought. The vision of the abyss also applies to the field of political, moral, and cultural action. Those who fight tyranny, who denounce injustices, who confront violence, must be aware of the temptation to repeat the forms of power they condemn. The revolutionary who does not look at himself may become a tyrant. The moral critic may turn into an authoritarian moralist. The philosopher may degenerate into a destructive nihilist. History is full of these examples. Looking into the abyss is, therefore, accepting the radical ambiguity of human existence. It is recognizing that evil is not only outside, but also inside. That lucidity does not protect us from falling. It only makes us aware of it. Maturity, for Nietzsche, is not about avoiding the abyss, but about learning to look at it without being consumed by it. If these reflections are awakening something in you, questions, curiosity, or even productive discomfort, feel free to subscribe to the channel. The expression "act without acting," a translation of the Chinese concept Wu Wei, is one of the central ideas in the Tao Te Ching, attributed to Laozi, the 6th century BC Taoist master. At first glance, this phrase seems paradoxical. How can one act without acting? But at the heart of this enigma is a profound conception of reality and conduct that challenges Western models of control, effort, and deliberate intention. For Laozi, the Tao, the Way, is the fundamental and impersonal principle that sustains, generates, and guides all phenomena in the universe. The Tao is not a god, nor a substance, nor an abstract metaphysical idea. It is the continuous flow of reality, the natural order of things that operates spontaneously, without external direction, imposition, or teleology. The Tao is the invisible, regularity behind constant change. Living in accordance with the Tao, therefore, is aligning oneself with the rhythm of reality. But this alignment is not an act of submission or passivity. It is a specific type of practical wisdom. Acting without, resisting what is, acting without forcing, without artificially interfering with the natural course of things. This is what Wu Wei means. Action that does not oppose the flow of the Tao. It is not literal inaction, but a way of acting in harmony with the structure of the real, rather than fighting against it. The modern Western conception of action is typically tied to the idea of will, planning, effort, and control. The individual must shape the world to their image, intervene, produce results, and master variables. This ethics of voluntaristic action, rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition, Renaissance humanism, and Enlightenment rationality, sees passivity as weakness and not acting as moral failure. Laozi proposes the opposite. The more we interfere, the more we destabilize, the more we force, the more resistance we create. In the Tao Te Ching, Wu Wei appears as the virtue of the wise ruler, the spiritual master, the person at peace with themselves. This type of action is not marked by anxiety for results, but by the appropriate response to the moment, sensitivity to what is happening, and trust in the self-regulation of reality. The wise person does not act hastily, does not anticipate, does not impose their will. They act by not acting, and in doing so, they accomplish. The Tao, by its very nature, operates through non-interference. It generates the world effortlessly, nourishes everything without demanding a return, transforms without possessing. Imitating the Tao, therefore, is to act with lightness, discretion, and spontaneity. The tree grows by itself, the river flows by itself, the sky moves by itself. The model of conduct is not the hero who conquers, but the sage who flows. It is not the general who imposes order, but the gardener who cares for time and land. On a psychological level, Wu Wei is also a response to the anxiety caused by mental hyperactivity. The constant effort to control thoughts, emotions, and situations is seen as the origin of suffering. The more we try to hold on to reality, the more it slips away. The mind that fights against itself wears out. The ego that demands absolute coherence from existence becomes frustrated. Wu Wei is, in this sense, a remedy for inattention. By stopping the fight against what is, the mind rests. This attitude is not resignation. Laozi does not advocate fatalism. He proposes a more subtle intelligence, knowing when to act and when not to act, when to speak and when to remain silent, when to intervene and when to wait. Acting without acting is a way of engaging with the world with attention, perception, and humility. The wise person does not rush because they know the rhythm of the Tao. They do not assert themselves forcefully because they do not need to dominate to be effective. This stance has radical ethical and political consequences. The ruler who practices Wu Wei does not govern by rigid laws, punishments, or manipulation. They govern by example, by quiet presence, by trust in the natural balance of relationships. In the Tao Te Ching, Laozi says the best leader is the one whose presence is almost unnoticed. When the people say, "We did it ourselves," it is because the ruler was wise enough not to impose themselves. From a metaphysical point of view, the idea of Wu Wei arises from the intuition that reality is self-sufficient in its process of transformation. There is no need for an external agent to order the world. The Tao operates in silence, with gentleness, with economy. The cycles of nature, the course of the seasons, the alternation between birth and death, all occur without the need for command. When humans interfere too much, it is like meddling with a delicate web. It creates imbalance, chaos, and pain. Laozi observes that excessive effort is a symptom of disconnection from the Tao. The warrior who forces victory, the politician who imposes their vision, the person who seeks to control life at any cost, all of these are out of harmony with the flow of reality. Suffering arises from rigidity, from obsession with results, from the inability to wait. Wu Wei, in contrast, is the way of flexibility, listening, and active adaptation. Like the bamboo that bends with the wind but does not break. This philosophy of non-action has deeply influenced Chinese thought, Zen Buddhism, martial arts, traditional medicine, and even the poetic aesthetics of the East. In Zen, for example, the right action arises from a state of full presence, not from egoic will. In Aikido, the practitioner defeats the opponent not by force, but by redirecting the energy of the attack. In all of these traditions, Wu Wei manifests as action without resistance, response without aggression, movement without tension. On a deeper level, Wu Wei is also an ontological attitude toward existence. It is not just an ethical principle, but a way of being. The person practicing Wu Wei does not separate themselves from reality. They are the very manifestation of the Tao. They do not act as the master of nature, but as part of it. Their action is like water. It permeates everything, nourishes everything, flows around everything, but never resists. Water is the supreme symbol of the Tao because it overcomes without fighting, acts without effort, transforms without violence. When Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, declared in his first sermon that existence is suffering, he wasn't making a pessimistic comment or expressing an emotional view of life. Instead, he was stating a fundamental and experiential truth, the first of the Four Noble Truths, Katari Arya Sakani, which form the core of Buddhist teachings. The original Pali term used is dukkha, often translated as suffering, but its meaning extends further. It encompasses pain, dissatisfaction, discomfort, imperfection, a universal characteristic of conditioned existence. The first noble truth states, "This, monks, is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, union with what is unpleasant is suffering, separation from what is pleasant is suffering, not getting what one wants is suffering. In short, the 5 aggregates of attachment are suffering. Samyutta Nikaya 5611. For the Buddha, suffering is not an exception to life. It is its structural condition. It is not something that only happens in times of tragedy or crisis, but something that pervades even what are considered happy or neutral states. Dissatisfaction is present in the very experience of embodied existence, marked by impermanence, anicca, non-self, anatta, and the compulsion of desire, tanha. The root of this suffering does not lie in external circumstances, but in the way we relate to reality. The common mind, conditioned by ignorance, avidya, tends to cling to what is pleasant and reject what is unpleasant. This dualistic movement, wanting pleasure and avoiding pain, is always in tension with the changing nature of things. Nothing remains. Nothing is fixed. Nothing can be possessed. Therefore, any attempt to secure permanence, control, or lasting satisfaction is doomed to failure. The Buddha identifies desire, tanha, as the immediate cause of suffering, a term which can also be understood as thirst or craving. This thirst manifests in three forms: sensory desire, kama tanha, the craving for sensory pleasures; desire for existence, bhava tanha, the urge to be, to exist, to assert oneself; desire for non-existence, vibhava tanha, the desire for negation, destruction, or escape. Ordinary life revolves around these three forms of desire. At every moment, the mind seeks what it deems pleasurable and avoids what it deems painful. This incessant process of wanting and rejecting keeps us trapped in the cycle of birth and death, samsara, marked by the repetitive compulsion of mental states, emotions, rebirths, and suffering. There is no liberation until this structure is understood and transcended. Suffering, therefore, is not located only in painful life events, but in the very way consciousness is structured within samsara. Even moments of pleasure carry the seed of suffering because they are temporary, dependent, and generate attachment. Pleasure is unstable, and when it disappears, it leaves behind emptiness and the craving for repetition. Pleasure is not the negation of suffering, but part of its mechanism. This understanding of suffering as universal and structural sharply contrasts with common Western responses to pain. While much of Western philosophy seeks to overcome suffering through rational mastery, technique, social organization, or hope for salvation, the Buddha proposes a path of inner investigation and mind transformation. Suffering is not a problem to be solved in the external world, but a reality to be understood and transcended within the experience itself. For this understanding to take place, the Buddha suggests developing direct wisdom, panya, which is not mere accumulation of intellectual knowledge, but the clear seeing of reality as it is. This requires constant practice of mindfulness, sati, meditation, samadhi, and ethical conduct, sila. Suffering can only be understood through direct experience, seeing, moment by moment, how attachment generates tension, how resistance to impermanence creates frustration, how the self that tries to assert itself is constantly in conflict with reality. This investigation leads to the recognition that the self that suffers is, in itself, an impermanent construction. What we call self is, in Buddhist analysis, just a collection of phenomena: body, sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, in constant change. There is no self that suffers. There is suffering that is interpreted as mine. When this is realized, the practitioner begins to undo their identification with the contents of the mind, with emotions, with the body, and opens space for the cessation of suffering. This cessation, called nibbana or nirvana, is not the extinction of being, but the extinction of thirst, attachment, and the illusion of a permanent self. It is a state of perfect peace, which does not depend on external circumstances, as it arises from the recognition that there is nothing to cling to, nothing to fear, nothing to defend. Suffering ceases when the desire for the world to be different, from what it is ceases. The idea that existence is suffering does not negate the beauty of life, nor does it suggest resignation. On the contrary, it proposes a clearer, more compassionate way of living, founded on the acceptance of impermanence and the dissolution of attachment. The practice of compassion, karuna, and equanimity, upekkha, naturally arises when we understand that all beings, without exception, are subject to the same suffering. Seeing suffering as universal is also the foundation of a radical ethics of non-violence and care. The teaching that existence is suffering is not a sentence of condemnation, but an invitation to wisdom, to face suffering head-on, without denial, without running away, without clinging to illusory hopes, is the first step to transcending pain. Buddhist clarity does not idealize the world, but it also does not reject it. It proposes overcoming ignorance through clarity, reactivity through inner silence, attachment through freedom. There is no map, no predetermined direction, no hidden purpose waiting to be discovered. For Jean-Paul Sartre, humans don't come into the world with an instruction manual or a destiny laid out for them. They simply exist. And once thrown into existence, they face the void of meaning that marks their condition. It is only from there that the most fundamental and inevitable task of life begins: to create meaning where nothing is given beforehand. The statement, "life has no inherent meaning," carries the weight of the radical responsibility Sartre places on the individual. In existentialist terms, this means that meaning is not discovered but created, and created without guarantees. There is no essential human nature, no soul with a divine purpose, no hidden cosmic reason that justifies what we are. Existence in itself is a raw fact, and it is up to the individual to transform it into a project. In his ontology, developed in being and nothingness, Sartre argues that the human being is a being for itself, être pour soi, meaning a consciousness that exists as a negation of what it is. Consciousness has no fixed essence, but is defined by its ability to surpass itself, to project itself into the future, to shape itself through choice. This distinguishes it from being in itself, être en soi, which characterizes objects, defined, closed, identical to themselves. The human being, on the other hand, is undefined by structure, a void to be filled by action. This is why Sartre says, existence precedes essence. At birth, a human being is nothing. They only become something through what they do. Their identity is not ready. It is built through their actions. There is no what one must be before exercising freedom. Thus, the meaning of life is not inherited, received, or revealed. It must be chosen, sustained, and lived. This radical freedom is at the heart of existential anguish. Since there is no transcendental guidance, every choice entirely falls on the individual. Anguish is not a passing feeling, but an ontological experience. It reveals that there is nothing outside of me that can legitimize my decisions. There is no predetermined human nature, no God, no eternal values, no absolute moral laws. Only me, my freedom, and the world where this freedom needs to be exercised. That's why Sartre says we are condemned to freedom. Freedom is not a choice, it is our condition. Even when we seem trapped, we still choose. We choose how to respond, what to accept, what to reject. Even silence or obedience are acts of choice. And by choosing, we create meaning, or we fall into the void. This void is not absolute nihilism. Sartre distinguishes himself from nihilism by asserting that, although meaning does not exist by itself, it can and must be created by the individual. This creation is not arbitrary, but situated. Freedom is never exercised in a vacuum, but within historical, material, and relational conditions. The subject is always in situation, inserted into a world they didn't choose, but one they can transform. What gives value to choice is not its foundation in eternal principles, but the subject's commitment to what they choose. Bad faith, mauvaise foi, a key concept in Sartre's philosophy, is the denial of this responsibility. It is the attempt to escape freedom by pretending to be an object, a role, or a function. The employee who says, "I'm just following orders," the person who defines themselves solely by their profession, the individual who claims, "I'm like this because I was raised this way," all are practicing bad faith, not because they're lying, but because they're avoiding the acknowledgement that they could have been, and still can be, something different. For Sartre, the creation of meaning requires authenticity, that is, the willingness to recognize freedom, even when it is uncomfortable. Living authentically means recognizing that I am the author of myself, and that my choices not only define me, but project an image of humanity that affects others. By acting, I am also stating what I consider valid for anyone. Thus, every choice has an implicit universal dimension, even though there is no objective morality. This is where Sartre's existential ethics takes shape. He does not propose commandments, but a criterion. Act as if humanity were watching. Every choice implicitly invents a value. There is no way to choose what is bad for me and good for others, because when I choose, I affirm an ideal of being human. Thus, even without God, even without a metaphysical morality, the subject carries the weight of their actions as part of humanity. This ethics does not offer security. The risk is structural. There's no way to predict if the meaning we choose will be enough, coherent, or shared. Often, the subject will create values in an indifferent world, facing others who reject them. But it is precisely this anguishing freedom that makes the human being responsible for shaping their life. Sartre understands that the desire to find an inherent meaning, given by divine order, spiritual essence, or universal logic, is tempting, but giving into it would be escaping from the human condition. Existentialism, by rejecting this comfort, does not devalue life. On the contrary, life only acquires value because it is not predefined. Each existential project is an attempt to answer a question that no system or doctrine can answer for us. Simone de Beauvoir defines the human being as the being that denies what is, because for her, humans are not fixed or completed beings, but are always in the process of transcending themselves. This idea, central to the existentialist philosophy, she shares with Jean-Paul Sartre, emphasizes the dynamic structure of human subjectivity. To exist is not just to be, but to become. And this always implies a rupture with the current state, a tension between what one is and what one can become. This denial that characterizes the human being is not a negative act in the sense of destruction, but a movement of transcendence. De Beauvoir starts from the idea that humans are, at the same time, a situated being, embodied, limited, conditioned, and a transcendent being, capable of going beyond what is given, of imagining, projecting, and transforming. Subjectivity, for her, is always in a state of misalignment with itself, as it does not coincide with its own facticity. Facticity refers to everything that is given: the body, social situation, personal history, and the circumstances of the world. But the human being is not limited to these givens. They are also freedom. And this freedom is what allows them to deny what they are in order to assert what they are not yet. In this movement lies the fundamental existential condition: overcoming. Oneself does not mean denying the body, history, or relationships. It means that the subject is never entirely confined to any definition. They are not just their social roles, their physical limitations, or their past actions. Whenever a person acts, chooses, desires, or imagines, they position themselves beyond what they are. They assert that they are not reduced to what they already are. This tension is experienced as anguish because it exposes the subject to permanent instability. There is no possible rest. The individual is always between what they were and what they are not yet. They are never identical to themselves. Consciousness, as Sartre also says, is nothing. It has no inherent content, but exists as a becoming, an open project. De Beauvoir, however, emphasizes the ethical and concrete nature of this condition, insisting that denying what one is does not mean rejecting the situation, but embracing it as a starting point for action. This denial, then, is the expression of human freedom. Unlike a fixed essence, human existence is a project. And every project implies a break with the present. Even when the individual chooses to maintain what they already are, this choice is an affirmation of freedom, not a return to essence, but a deliberate exercise of staying the same. There is no neutrality. Even staying the same is a choice. For this reason, Beauvoir insists that humans are condemned to invent themselves at every moment. And this invention does not occur in an abstract space, but within concrete conditions, which impose resistances, pressures, and structural forces. The denial of what one is does not occur in a vacuum, but in a bounded field of possibilities. What she calls existential ambiguity. Ambiguity is a key concept in her work. The human being is ambiguous because they are simultaneously finite and infinite body and consciousness given and project. This ambiguity cannot be resolved, it must be embraced. The error, for Beauvoir, lies in both the denial of freedom, when the subject reduces themselves to their situation, and the denial of facticity, when the subject believes themselves to be pure transcendence. Ethics, for her, lies in living this ambiguity without trying to dissolve it into absolutes. Those who attempt to fix themselves into a rigid identity, who refuse to transcend themselves, who cling to what they already are, live in bad faith. They reject the weight of freedom, but the opposite is also true. Those who live as though they are absolutely free, ignoring the concrete limits of existence, live in an illusion of omnipotence. Real freedom is not the denial of conditions, but the possible transformation within them. This view has important implications for morality. There are no absolute rules, ready-made formulas, or eternal essences. But there is an ethical demand to not refuse freedom, neither one's own nor that of others. The denial of what one is, in this sense, must also be an affirmation of a future where freedom can expand, where others can also transcend their conditions. My freedom only fully realizes itself to the extent that it recognizes and sustains the freedom of others. This perspective is clearly seen in The Ethics of Ambiguity, where Beauvoir explores how existence demands engagement. Freedom, by denying what is, cannot remain on the abstract level. It must commit to the world, to others, to history. The human being only realizes themselves as freedom by transforming the world they are in. It is also for this reason that, for Beauvoir, women, or any oppressed subject, cannot be defined by their condition. The fact that they have been historically subordinated does not imply an inferior feminine essence. On the contrary, what defines humanity is precisely not being defined once and for all. The struggle for freedom is an expression of this creative denial. By denying their state of oppression, the subject affirms their ability to transcend it, even when the conditions seem rigid or hostile. The denial of what one is, then, is not nihilism, but dynamism. Identity, for Beauvoir, is never a substance. It is always a historical construction, situated and open to transformation. To be is always to be in motion, and this movement demands choices, risks, and exposure. The weight of this freedom is also the source of the constant anguish that accompanies existence. Every choice excludes others. Every project can fail. Every action has consequences. But to deny this weight is to deny the very human condition. For Beauvoir, living is affirming this openness without guarantees, this permanent oscillation between what we are and what we can be, always with our eyes on what has yet to be achieved. For Arthur Schopenhauer, human life is an incessant manifestation of lack. To To live is to desire, and to desire is to experience absence. From this fundamental observation, he asserts that desire is the source of all suffering, not as a moral judgment, but as an ontological structure of existence. Desire, understood as the expression of the will, is what moves human beings, but also what condemns them to pain, restlessness, and continuous frustration. In The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer presents a radically pessimistic metaphysics. The world we know, with its forms, colors, sounds, and relationships, is merely representation, a construct of the human mind that organizes reality according to the forms of time, space, and causality. However, behind this phenomenal appearance, there is something that is not representation: the will. The will is not rational, nor conscious, nor goal-oriented. It is a blind, impersonal, irrational force that manifests at all levels of nature. In the instinct for survival, sexual drive, the pursuit of power, and natural cycles. The human being, as part of this reality, is objectified will, an incarnation of this force that desires to perpetuate itself at all costs. Thus, our essence is not rationality, nor soul, nor moral freedom. It is wanting, the pure impulse of affirmation and continuity. Desiring is, therefore, the way the will expresses itself in individual existence. But to desire is also to be in lack. It is to recognize that one is incomplete, that something essential has yet to be achieved. And even when desire is satisfied, the satisfaction is temporary. The peace that follows pleasure is brief, for soon the movement of lack, restlessness, and dissatisfaction returns. The will never rests. And that is why, for Schopenhauer, human existence is essentially suffering. Pleasure, when it occurs, is not a full positive state. It is merely the momentary cessation of pain. There is no pure pleasure. There is only relief from tension, a temporary absence of pain. Therefore, he states that pleasure is negative in its structure. Pain, on the other hand, is positive. It imposes itself, is felt, and demands a response. Pain reveals the true condition of existence. Pleasure, at most, is a moment of suspension. This cycle is inevitable because it is rooted in the very nature of the will. When we satisfy one desire, another arises. And the more refined the consciousness, the more complex and demanding the desires become. Humans suffer more than animals because they are more conscious. They anticipate the future, dwell on the past, compare possibilities, imagine other possible worlds. Intelligence, in this system, is not a blessing, but an enlargement of suffering. Schopenhauer observes that human life moves between two poles, pain and boredom. Pain arises from the absence of what is desired. Boredom appears when all momentary desires are satisfied, and the individual faces emptiness. Boredom is the sophisticated form of pain, the pain that emerges from the absence of desire. The pendulum of existence swings between these two extremes, with no true rest. This conception brings him closer to Buddhism, which he read and admired. Like Buddha, Schopenhauer recognizes that desire, tanha in Buddhist language, is the source of all suffering. And like Buddha, he proposes the cessation of desire as the only path to inner peace. But while Buddhism offers a disciplined and compassionate way to overcome desire, Schopenhauer maintains that the denial of the will is a tragic gesture, accessible only to a few: the wise, the ascetics, the contemplative artists. The denial of the will is not suicide, because suicide is still an affirmation of the will, an attempt to eliminate pain, to free oneself from suffering, and therefore motivated by desire. True denial of the will requires inner transformation, a voluntary renunciation of all desires, an asceticism that abandons wanting as the guiding principle of life. It is a kind of metaphysical stillness. The individual, upon recognizing the nature of the will, decides no longer to participate in its game. This attitude manifests in the lives of saints, mystics, and contemplative sages. But it can also be intuited in the aesthetic experience. Art, especially music, has the power to temporarily suspend the will. When we lose ourselves in a work of art, We forget ourselves, our desires, our anxieties. For a brief moment, we experience the world as pure contemplation, without possession, without lack, without will. However, this suspension is always temporary. The will returns. Desire reappears. The cycle begins again. The aesthetic experience is merely a gap, a possible anticipation of the deeper denial. Therefore, for Schopenhauer, the only salvation lies in liberation from wanting. There is no possible happiness as long as life is driven by desire. The ethics that follows from this view is an ethics of compassion and renunciation. By recognizing that all beings suffer for the same reason, they are trapped in the will in incessant desire, the individual can develop radical empathy, a silent pity before others. Compassion, for Schopenhauer, is the only true foundation of morality because it comes from recognizing shared pain, not abstract principles. This ethics is silent, dark, and deep. It is not based on commandments, but on clarity. By seeing the essence of existence as suffering caused by desire, the wise individual does not seek to increase their power, but to lessen their exposure to wanting. They withdraw from the race, from competition, from accumulation. They live with simplicity, contemplation, and detachment. They know that to desire is to be in lack, and that all possession, all victory, all pleasure are merely variations of the same restlessness. If these reflections are awakening something in you, questions, curiosity, or even productive discomfort, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. Carl Gustav Jung believed that most human suffering doesn't come from external tragedies, but from the ignorance people have about themselves. The phrase, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate," clearly expresses the deep structure of his analytical psychology. Much of what a person attributes to chance, karma, or fate is actually the effect of unconscious psychic content influencing their behavior, choices, and emotions. 4. Jung, the unconscious is not just a storage of repressed memories or suppressed desires, as Freud suggested. It is a living, structured system that contains both forgotten personal experiences and inherited collective, archetypal elements. The unconscious, in Jung's view, is active. It's not a void or absence, but an instance that participates in the construction of the psyche and decisively influences conscious life, especially when ignored. The problem is that, without realizing it, the individual identifies with their ego, the center of consciousness, and believes that it is all that exists. They live as if they were fully rational, masters of their will, free in their decisions. But in practice, much of what they decide, feel, and attract doesn't come from conscious choices, but from unconscious dynamics quietly operating behind the scenes of the psyche. This is why Jung sees becoming conscious as the fundamental axis of psychological development. The unconscious, when ignored, directs the course of life from the shadow, a set of aspects of the personality that the ego doesn't recognize as its own because they are judged unacceptable, shameful, or dangerous. These aspects don't disappear. They are projected onto the outside world, casting people, situations, and events with disproportionate emotional weight. This projection mechanism is one of the most common ways the unconscious governs life. A person meets someone and feels immediate repulsion, not because they know the person, but because the other mirrors something rejected within themselves. The other becomes the stage for an unresolved inner drama. What is experienced as bad luck, an impossible relationship, or repeated patterns, is often the symbolic repetition of an unintegrated inner dynamic. In this context, the idea of fate arises as a rationalization. The individual says they have bad luck in love, that they always attract the same type of people, that they were born to suffer, when in reality they are unconsciously drawn to experiences that correspond to repressed parts of their psyche. What seems to come from the outside actually comes from within, and will continue to repeat until the content is brought into consciousness. Becoming conscious, therefore, is not a mere superficial introspection, but a long and painful process of confronting oneself. Jung calls this process individuation, the path by which the individual stops being a social persona and begins to integrate the multiple aspects of their total psychic reality. Individuation doesn't aim for a strong ego, but for an ego that can engage with the unconscious, endure its images, and recognize its impulses without being consumed by them. This process is deeply symbolic. The unconscious speaks through images, dreams, symptoms, lapses, impulses, repetitions. Interpreting these signs is not about deciphering them as rigid codes, but understanding them in the context of the individual's life. A dream of falling, for example, may not mean failure, but a need to give up total control. A recurring physical symptom may be the body's language expressing a chronically denied emotion. A repeated behavior may be enacting an unrecognized wound. Consciousness, for Jung, is not natural. It is an achievement. And its expansion requires courage. Courage to realize that not everything within oneself is beautiful, acceptable, or moral. The shadow, when recognized, reveals aggressive, jealous, manipulative, petty tendencies. But denying it only strengthens its power. Jung warns that what is not integrated becomes fate. The unconscious will insist, through pain or repetition, until it is acknowledged. This principle also applies to what Jung called complexes, autonomous emotional nuclei in the personal unconscious that form from past experiences, especially traumatic or unresolved ones. A complex of abandonment, for example, may make the person sabotage relationships out of fear of the pain they anticipate. They don't consciously choose to act this way, but they do. The complex manifests with its own force, as if it were a separate psychic entity. Jung sees these complexes as partial personalities that momentarily take control of the psyche. And the less the individual knows them, the more they decide for them. Again, the idea appears that what is unconscious becomes fate. The same logic applies to family wounds, inherited patterns, generational traumas. What is not seen repeats, in a new form, but with the same content. Becoming conscious is therefore not an isolated act of understanding, but a continuous commitment to integrating the totality of the psyche. It is abandoning the illusion of absolute control, full coherence, and inner purity. It is accepting that the soul is contradictory, rich in images and conflicts, and that living consciously means inhabiting this space with attention, humility, and responsibility. The great change, according to Jung, happens when the individual stops saying, "This happened to me," and begins asking, "Why does this affect me?" Or, "What part of me is involved in this?" At this moment, the unconscious stops being a hidden tyrant and becomes a partner in the process of self-knowledge. Nothing lasts. Everything you love will change or disappear. One of the fundamental teachings of Buddha is the recognition that everything conditioned is impermanent. This simple, direct, yet profoundly transformative truth is expressed by the term anicca in Pali, which doesn't just mean that things change, but that there is nothing stable, eternal, or fixed within the realm of experience. Everything is born, transforms, and dissolves. Everything that arises also ceases. This applies to objects, mental states, relationships, thoughts, sensations, memories, everything that makes up embodied existence. In Buddha's first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, he outlines the three characteristics of existence: anicca, impermanence; dukkha, suffering, unsatisfactoriness; and anatta, non-self. Impermanence is not just an observable phenomenon, but the key to understanding why ordinary existence is marked by pain. We suffer because we cling to what changes. We want pleasure to last, relationships to remain, our bodies to stay young, and life to keep us safe from loss. But this is impossible. The structure of reality is transient. Nothing is exempt from the flow. Buddha doesn't present impermanence as a doctrine to be accepted by faith. He invites the practitioner to directly observe reality with full attention, moment by moment. By meditating, observing the body, thoughts, and emotions, one notices that nothing stays the same for 2 consecutive moments. Breathing flows, the heart beats, pain comes and goes, thoughts arise and dissolve, moods shift. The inner reality is a continuous river of change. This observation also applies to the external world. Everything that seems solid, mountains, cities, traditions, empires, eventually declines. The things we own wear out. The people we love die. Time corrodes everything. Impermanence is not an exception. It is the universal rule. And the more we try to resist it, the more we suffer. Every attachment is, ultimately, an act of denial of impermanence. Suffering, therefore, arises from the clash between the desire for permanence and the reality of change. We want love to remain as it was in the beginning, for the young body to last forever, for the joy of a moment to freeze in time. But time doesn't stop, and what we want to hold on to begins to change. And that's when we feel fear, insecurity, and frustration. Realizing that everything we love will change or disappear, we are overtaken by the anxiety of imminent loss. The ordinary mind tries to avoid this anguish with distraction strategies, idealizations, promises of eternity, beliefs in post-death, permanence, compulsive consumption, comforting narratives. But for Buddha, all of these attempts are forms of ignorance, avijja. Liberation can only occur when we accept, with clarity and courage, that nothing belonging to the conditioned world can offer absolute security. The awareness of impermanence, far from being an invitation to despair, is the gateway to wisdom. When we understand that everything changes, it becomes possible to let go of attachment, cultivate equanimity, and live with more compassionate and mindful presence. Buddhist practice doesn't aim to eliminate suffering by suppressing emotions, but to transform the way we relate to them. Pain, joy, pleasure, loss, everything is transient, and everything can be observed without attachment. In the context of vipassana meditation, insight meditation, the practitioner trains exactly this perception. Seeing sensations arise and disappear, thoughts flowing like clouds, the body changing moment to moment. By observing without judgment, without identification, intuitive wisdom begins to emerge. I am not this. I cannot hold on to this. There is no fixed self here. Impermanence becomes a direct experience, not just a concept. This realization has profound ethical implications. If everything changes, then the moods that take us over today will also pass. Hatred, passion, euphoria, sadness, all arise and disappear. This helps us not to act based on transient impulses, to cultivate patience, tolerance, and compassion. It also teaches us to value the present more. There are no guarantees of tomorrow, no return to the past. Life only happens in this fleeting moment. Understanding impermanence also dissolves arrogance, greed, and craving. If everything dissolves, why obsessively accumulate? Why compete fiercely? Why boast of achievements that time will erase? Impermanence teaches us humility and, at the same time, freedom. For by knowing that everything changes, we also realize that suffering can change, that pain is not eternal, that what seems impossible today may become possible tomorrow. Suffering is also impermanent. In Mahayana Buddhism, this perception is expanded in the concept of shunyata, emptiness, where it is stated that nothing has inherent existence. Everything exists interdependently, as part of networks in constant transformation. Impermanence is not just temporal but structural. There is no fixed identity in anything. What we call self is, in fact, a flowing process, a continuous construction of aggregates, khandhas, without a permanent core. Recognizing this reality deconstructs attachment to the ego, which is the root of suffering. The desire for control, status, self-assertion, eternal recognition. All of this stems from the illusion that there is a durable self that needs protection. But, as Buddha teaches, the self is as impermanent as any other phenomenon. Liberation arises when we abandon the belief in the solidity of the self and live as part of the flow. Nothing escapes. Everything changes. Everything you love, youth, relationships, places, words, dreams, is subject to dissolution. But it is precisely by accepting this truth that the possibility opens to live with less fear, less demand, less attachment. When you look at the world without expecting it to last, beauty becomes more intense and suffering less paralyzing. You are not born with an essence. You create it, or create nothing at all. When Jean-Paul Sartre says existence precedes essence, he is stating the core of his existentialist philosophy. This represents a radical reversal of the metaphysical and religious traditions that, for centuries, held that humans are born with a predetermined nature, a fixed identity, or an intrinsic purpose. Sartre breaks from this model. There is no human essence before the act of existing. A human being first exists, and only afterward defines what they are. To understand this idea, we need to see how it contrasts with two key concepts in Western tradition. The first is the theological view, which holds that God creates humans with a purpose, a plan, a mission, a moral or spiritual nature that defines their being. The second is the rationalist or humanist idea that humans are by nature rational or moral beings, with fixed traits that determine their behavior. In both cases, essence precedes existence. What a person is given before they exist in the concrete world. Sartre rejects both. He starts from an atheistic position and asserts that if God does not exist, then there is no fixed human nature predetermined. This doesn't mean that anything goes, but that each human being is responsible for inventing themselves from nothing. There is no self ready to be revealed. There is only the project each individual undertakes. The statement, therefore, has both an ontological and ethical weight. Ontologically, it means that humans are beings who do not have an established essence. They are a void, a possibility, an open project. Ethically, it means that each person is responsible for everything they do with themselves. There are no excuses, no absolute determinisms, no fixed natures. Humans are condemned to be free, and this freedom places them before the permanent demand to construct themselves. In his book, Existentialism is a Humanism, Sartre illustrates this idea with a simple example. An object like a knife or a letter opener is made with a specific purpose. Its essence, the set of properties and functions that define it, is present in the mind of its maker before its physical existence. With human beings, it is not like that. Humans are not made. They appear first, undefined, and must invent themselves throughout their lives. This appearance is not neutral. A person is thrown into the world, born, grows up, finds themselves in a certain culture, class, body, historical time. But this facticity, the given data of existence, does not define what they are in their entirety. A human being is what they do with what they were made to be. They constantly transcend their situation, denying it, overcoming it, reinterpreting it. This movement of transcendence is what constitutes human existence as freedom. This point is essential to understand why Sartre says that essence is not given. It's not about denying that there are social, psychological, or material influences. It's about refusing to accept these influences as absolute determinants. A human being, though limited, always has a margin of freedom. And within that margin, they define themselves. The choice is inevitable. Even inertia, escape, and conformity are choices. Even not wanting to be anything is a mode of being. The subject, then, is solely responsible for their own construction. They choose at every moment who they will be, and in doing so, they project an image of humanity. When I choose to be a certain way, I am implicitly asserting that this way of being has value, that this is a legitimate way of being human. That's why Sartre says that when a person chooses themselves, they choose for all of humanity. Every existential project carries a universal dimension. This responsibility is unsettling. Without an essence to guide us, without fixed values to support our choices, we are alone in our decisions. Anguish is not just an emotion, but an ontological experience. It's the vertigo of realizing that it's up to me to decide what's right, what's good, what's worthwhile, without any guarantee of being correct. There is no external foundation to justify choices. Freedom is total. And because of this, the weight of existence rests entirely on the subject. Bad faith, mauvaise foi, is the attempt to escape this weight. It's when a person tries to convince themselves that they are not free, that they are determined by their nature, role, or history. The waiter who exaggerates his gestures, trying to be a real waiter, acts as if he is defined by the social role he occupies. The individual who says, "I had no choice," is denying their freedom. But for Sartre, bad faith is a form of existential lying. It depends on knowing that one is free, while simultaneously denying that freedom. Freedom, however, does not imply arbitrariness. It's not about doing anything on a whim. Sartre's freedom is always in a situation. The subject is in the world, with others, in specific contexts, but within that world, they are free to position themselves, interpret, resist, or accept. And it is in this movement that they create their essence. There is no essence without action. There is no identity without choice. There is no meaning without a project. The risk accompanying this freedom is that a person might build nothing. They might live in bad faith, refuse their responsibility, blindly adopt the values of others. They might let themselves be carried away. In that case, their existence will be empty, inauthentic, marked by resentment or conformity. Essence will not come from outside, and if it is not built, it simply won't exist. For Sartre, a human being is nothing other than what they make of themselves. There is no final destination. All we have is the moment, and it passes. Zen philosophy dissolves the boundary between beginning, middle, and end. When we say the path is the goal, we challenge one of the most deeply ingrained structures of Western thought. The idea that there is a fixed destination to be reached, a final goal that will give meaning to all previous efforts. In Zen, we don't walk towards something, we walk as something. The act of walking itself is the meaning. There is no arrival, there is only walking. This wisdom traces back to Chinese Chan and Japanese Zen, schools of Mahayana Buddhism that radicalize the experience of non-duality and awakening as a concrete practice. In Zen, the ideas of progress, accumulation, and spiritual success are constantly questioned. Zen masters emphasize that the search for enlightenment is often the greatest obstacle to enlightenment. Because as one searches, one projects a future, an ideal, an achievement, and in doing so, escapes the present. The present is all that there is. This is one of the pillars of Zen. And the present, by its very nature, is transient, fleeting, impermanent. The moment cannot be held. It cannot be analyzed, dissected, or stored. It can only be lived. And for that, one must unlearn the logic of control and anticipation. Zen teaches us to be, not to conquer. In Zen tradition, especially in the writings of Eihai Dogen, 13th century, time is not a line. It's a flow in which being and time are identical. The present moment is not a part of time. It is time. Every moment is complete in itself, without depending on what came before or what will come after. This means that every action, no matter how simple, is a full expression of reality. Eating, walking, sitting, breathing, all are practices of the path when done with total attention. This is why, in Zen, the practice of Zazen, seated meditation, is not a means to achieve something. You do not meditate to calm down, to find peace, or to reach a higher state. You meditate to meditate. When you sit in Zazen, the simple act of being there, present, breathing, with an upright spine and a quiet mind, is the very realization. Trying to gain something from Zazen is already stepping out of Zazen. The path is sitting. The goal is sitting. This approach challenges the ego. The ego is always restless, projecting goals, seeking results, wanting control. In Zen, the ego is seen as a mental construct based on desires, fears, and identifications. It lives in psychological time, past and future, and rarely stays in the now. Therefore, the Zen path is also a path of emptying the ego, not through violent denial, but through the clear perception of its impermanence and irrelevance in the face of life that simply is. The idea that the path is the goal also opposes the linear logic of productivity. In daily life, we are taught to think of everything as steps toward an end. We study to pass, we work to rise, we live to get there, but there never comes. Every achievement leads to another goal. Every rest hides a new anxiety. It's a race that never ends, and at the end of it, we always feel a little emptier. Zen interrupts this cycle with a seemingly simple phrase, just this. This that is happening now. This moment, this breath, this sound, this emotion is all that there is. There is no real life after this, nor a right time to begin living fully. Life is now, and if it is not lived now, it will not be lived at any other time. By realizing this, the practitioner gives up the frantic search for revelations and starts finding meaning in the most common actions. Enlightenment stops being an extraordinary event and becomes the act of washing a bowl, cutting an onion, sweeping the floor, smiling at someone. There is no hierarchy between acts. Zen teaches that every moment contains the totality of being. This teaching is also reflected in how Zen masters approach learning. A disciple who asks, "When will I be ready?" or "How long will it take?" is trapped in the idea that there is a destination at the end of the path. But the true teaching is not in the future. It is in the answer the master gives now, in the silence between words, in the gesture that points to what cannot be said. Spiritual time is not chronological. It is vertical. It is the moment. Everything passes. This is the other side of the teaching. And that's why the moment is precious. Zen is not nihilistic. It doesn't say that nothing matters because everything changes. On the contrary, it says that everything matters precisely because everything changes. What is loved will disappear. The words left unsaid will never be repeated. The touch that wasn't offered will not be recovered. Thus, living the moment fully is also an act of reverence for impermanence. The path as the goal also implies a special kind of freedom. Freedom from the need to prove yourself, from the need to explain yourself, from the need to reach an external ideal. This freedom is not hedonistic or negligent. It is a form of discipline without rigidity, a commitment to the now without being tied to the later. When doing is for itself, acting becomes light, full, and silently effective. Zen practice, in this sense, makes no promises. It doesn't say you'll be happy or that you'll achieve anything. It simply says, sit, breathe, observe. What you find will be what was already there, only now, without the layers of expectation and comparison. The path is the moment you walk, and walking with awareness is already being where you need to be. If these reflections are awakening something in you, questions, curiosity, or even productive discomfort, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Freedom is not comfortable. It is a constant fall into the unknown. Anguish is not a pathology of the soul, nor an emotional accident. It is a deep existential experience, inseparable from the human condition as a free being. When Søren Kierkegaard writes that anguish is the dizziness of freedom, he is revealing the most unsettling truth about existence. Freedom is an abyss, and when we face it, we do not feel peace. We feel dizziness. Freedom is not lightness. It is responsibility, uncertainty, the choice in the face of nothingness. Kierkegaard was one of the first thinkers to articulate what the 20th century would call existentialism, although he himself was deeply Christian and his project was embedded in theological reflection. In the concept of anguish, he describes anguish not as fear of something specific, but as an indefinite feeling in the face of possibility. It is not about what already is. It is about what is not yet, but could be. Fear has an object. You fear an animal, a disease, a loss. Anguish, on the other hand, has no face. It is the unease that arises when a person realizes they are free, and that therefore they can choose among multiple paths, including those that lead to self-destruction, loss, or guilt. Kierkegaard gives the example of a child at the edge of a cliff. The child looks down and feels a mix of fear and attraction. The child doesn't just fear the fall, they feel the possibility of throwing themselves. Anguish is born from this freedom toward the absurd. This freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want. It is more radical. It is the ontological openness of the human being to the possible. We are beings of possibility. We are not defined by a fixed essence, a determined role, or an eternal function. We are thrown into the world with the task of constituting ourselves, and this constitution happens through choice. But each choice is a renunciation, and none are guaranteed. No choice can protect us from doubt or error. Anguish is the inevitable side effect of being free. For Kierkegaard, this anguish arises from the very genesis of sin. In his reinterpretation of Adam's fall, sin does not come from evil, but from the anguishing freedom. Adam did not sin out of malice. He sinned because he could sin. His innocence was not purity, but ignorance of his own freedom. When confronted with the possibility of disobedience, he experienced anguish, and then chose. Freedom, when revealed, is not clarity. It is existential weight. Freedom makes us fall, but it is in this fall that the human being becomes truly human. What Kierkegaard calls the fall is not a moral failure, but a plunge into the reality that we are the agents of our choices. And this is not comfortable. There is a price to knowing we are free. The end of certainties, the disappearance of guarantees, the collapse of spiritual crutches. Anguish is the feeling of looking into the void and realizing that it is up to us to decide. Anguish, therefore, is not a mistake to be corrected. It is a stage of consciousness, a waking up. It reveals that the human being is not determined. They are possibility. We are not simply natural beings. We are beings who know that we are. And by knowing that we are, we also know that we could be different. The human being is not just what they are. They are also what they are not yet, and what they could become. This openness is unbearable for many, hence the appeal of norms, dogmas, systems, and authorities. Kierkegaard sees these as forms of escape from anguish. The individual who refuses to decide, who outsources their choices, who lives according to the herd's standards, seeks to avoid dizziness. They try to silence the call of freedom through conformity, but in doing so, they abandon their uniqueness. Uniqueness is one of the central concepts in Kierkegaard's philosophy. For him, every human being is a unique before God, which means that truth is not universal, but lived. Each person must find their path, not as the application of formulas, but as a personal response to an existence marked by contingency. Anguish is not the end of this path, it is its beginning. Only those who go through it can begin to live authentically. The anguished freedom also manifests in moral decisions. Kierkegaard rejects ethical systems that propose impersonal rules for all situations. For him, true ethics is lived in the concrete, in the real choice, in the tension between what we are and what we want to be. There is no recipe for acting right. There is responsibility, And this responsibility is lived as anguish because we never know for sure if we've chosen the right thing. We only know that it was we who chose. This tension reaches its peak in the leap of faith, the moment when the individual, faced with the impossibility of rational justification, risks stepping into the unknown. Faith, for Kierkegaard, is not certainty. It is decision. It is the leap beyond reason, when there is no ground, but you still jump. This leap does not eliminate anguish. It includes it. There is no faith without dizziness. There is no authentic choice without an abyss. In his language, Kierkegaard distinguishes three stages of life: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. The aesthetic man lives for pleasure, for the immediate, for the denial of anguish. But this way of life ends in boredom and despair. The ethical man assumes responsibility for their life, but still seeks justifications within rationality and universal morality. The religious man, finally, is the one who assumes anguish as the condition of existence and chooses to live the paradox. They do not eliminate suffering, they pass through it. Freedom, then, is fall. It is dizziness. It is anguish. But it is also the supreme dignity of the human being. To be free is to be called to choose in the face of nothingness. And this is precisely what makes us capable of truth, love, and faith. Anguish is not a flaw of freedom. It is proof that it is real. It is real. In the face of the cosmic vastness, human existence seems irrelevant, and this is terrifying. Blaise Pascal, a 17th century mathematician, physicist, and philosopher, wrote this line in one of the most impactful fragments of his work Pensée, which was gathered posthumously from notes for a treatise on the Christian faith. With this statement, Pascal gives shape to the metaphysical anguish triggered by contemplating the universe. When looking at the starry sky, at the infinite space, at the silent vastness surrounding human life, Pascal does not feel awe, he feels dread. Modern science had radically expanded the view of the world. Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler had dethroned humankind. The Earth was no longer the center of the cosmos. The universe ceased to be a divine theater and became an infinite, indifferent space. Human reason, so celebrated by Cartesian rationalism, now found itself facing a cold, silent world with no visible purpose. It was impossible not to feel the abyss. Pascal captures, in this fragment, the central conflict of human existence. We are thought, beings who are conscious of ourselves, and the world, but we are embedded in an impersonal universe that does not even notice us. We know that we exist, that we suffer, that we desire, that we die. But the universe, this incomprehensible theater, remains silent. And this silence is not neutral. It is a void that echoes the absence of meaning. When I consider the brevity of my life absorbed in the eternity before and after, the small space I occupy, and see it swallowed by the infinite immensity of spaces that I do not know and which ignore me, I am terrified, and I marvel at being here and not there. Because there is no reason to be here and not in another place, Pascal writes. Here, human consciousness confronts its absolute contingency. Nothing guarantees our existence. Nothing justifies our place. This feeling is not merely intellectual. It is existential. It is a radical anguish born from the human capacity to reflect on itself and realize that, although it thinks and feels, it is also finite, fragile, and fleeting. We can measure the stars, calculate orbits, invent machines, but we are thrown into time, subject to death, and unable to find an absolute foundation for the meaning of life through reason alone. It is at this point that Pascal departs from Descartes' rationalism. Although he was a mathematical and scientific genius, he distrusted reason as a tool capable of providing comfort or salvation. Reason shows us the vastness of the universe, but it does not offer us a safe place within it. Instead, it exposes our smallness. Man, for Pascal, is a middle ground between everything and nothing, large compared to the atom. infinitesimal in the face of infinity. This paradox is fundamental. Human beings are great because they think, but they despair because they think about their own smallness. The animal does not suffer from its finitude because it is not aware of it. The angel, if it exists, does not suffer because it is pure spirit. Humans suffer because they are this hybrid. They think, but they die. They feel, but they disappear, and there is no evident answer to this. Pascal's statement anticipates one of the central questions of modern and contemporary philosophy, the experience of the absurd. Centuries later, Albert Camus will describe the same feeling, saying that the absurd arises from the confrontation between the human desire for meaning and the world's inexplicable silence. The universe does not respond. The silence of the infinite spaces is the same silence of Camus' cosmos, a void where we project our questions with no return. Pascal does not seek refuge in illusions. He recognizes the horror of nothingness, but he also refuses to let reason be enough to solve this dilemma. Therefore, his proposal is the leap of faith. If reason shows us the disproportion between man and the universe, the heart, that which feels, loves, and intuits, can open us to another dimension, that of grace. God is not proven, but revealed to the heart. Pascal's wager is existential. In the face of uncertainty, it is more reasonable to bet that God exists than not. However, the phrase about the infinite spaces is not an immediate invitation to faith. It is a diagnosis. It reveals the spiritual helplessness of modern man, thrown into a scientific world, but spiritually barren. The cosmos has ceased to be a home inhabited by gods or by a close God. It has become infinite, but impersonal. And in this impersonality, human existence seems to lose all the centrality it once had. This feeling also echoes in many existential and religious traditions. The psalmist asks, "What is man that you are mindful of him?" Psalm 8. The Christian, mystical tradition speaks of God's silence, of spiritual abandonment. Japanese Zen speaks of emptiness, shunyata, as the ultimate nature of reality. The difference is that, for Pascal, this silence is not an answer. It is the lack of an answer that forces us to seek another type of listening. What makes Pascal's anguish so penetrating is that it is born from the encounter between science and consciousness. He does not reject reason, but he shows its limits. He does not despise knowledge, but he exposes its power to destroy comfortable illusions. By learning more about the universe, we lose our centrality. By understanding the vastness, we face our insignificance. The light of science illuminates an even greater void. This abyss, however, does not necessarily lead to nihilism. Pascal envisions, in this same consciousness that anguishes, the possibility of faith, but not naive faith, not dogmatic belief, but faith that comes from recognizing our own fragility, which does not impose itself through reason, but offers itself to the heart. The silence of the infinite spaces may terrify us, but it also brings us to our knees before a mystery that surpasses any calculation. The ultimate reality cannot be explained. All language is inadequate. The Tao Te Ching begins with a negation. Even before offering any positive definition, Laozi states, "The Tao that can be told is not the true Tao." This opening sentence, concise, enigmatic, and profound, sets the foundation for all Taoist wisdom. Ultimate reality is beyond words, concepts, and classifications. It cannot be contained by any description, and any attempt to do so is, by definition, a falsification. In the original Chinese, the term Tao carries multiple meanings: path, way, method, principle, natural order. However, all these meanings are still approximations. The true Tao, as Laozi suggests, is that which gives rise to and sustains all things, but cannot be captured by any name or image. It is prior to the differentiation between being and non-being, prior to form, prior to language. It is the mystery present in everything, but that escapes rational apprehension. By declaring the Tao that can be told is not the true Tao, Laozi warns us about the inherent limitation of language. Every word fixes, names, and cuts. Every description transforms the living flow of reality into a conceptual, static, and separate object. Yet, the Tao is flow. It is incessant transformation. It manifests in birth and death, in movement and cessation, in the alternation between yin and yang, and for that reason, any attempt to define it distorts it. This principle resonates with mystical traditions from various cultures, but in Taoism, it is at the center of reflection. Taoist thought is anti-dogmatic, silent, and intuitive. It rejects rigid metaphysical systems, absolute theories, and fixed formulas. True wisdom is not about knowing more, but about unlearning excess conceptualization. It is a return to simplicity prior to judgment, to the mind before the division between subject and object. In this sense, language is useful for social functioning, political discourse, and the practical organization of life, but it is inadequate for grasping the living totality of reality. When we try to name the Tao, we have already moved away from it. Laozi writes, "The name is the mother of all particular things." In other words, it is by naming that we create multiplicity. It is by separating that we lose the original unity. The Tao, as origin, cannot be named without ceasing to be what it is. This teaching brings profound philosophical and existential implications. Reason, discursive thought, the desire to control and categorize reality. All of these are movements that, while useful on one level, move us away from direct contact with the mystery. Language builds a world of symbols, but confusing this symbolic world with the real is the great error. Laozi invites us to go beyond the veil of language to reconnect with direct experience. In Taoist practice, this means cultivating inner silence, non-interfering observation, and a state of receptive presence. The Taoist sage does not seek to impose a truth on the world. He does not argue with words. He observes the cycles of nature, learns from the water, the wind, the rhythms of the sky and the earth. His wisdom is non-verbal, because it arises from a deep listening to life in its fluid, non-conceptual dimension. This attitude is linked to the central idea of Wu Wei, acting without forced effort, or action through non-action. The sage does not act from abstract concepts, but in response to the moment, with lightness and appropriateness. He acts according to the Tao, not according to formulas. And this is only possible because he is not attached to language, but to the direct perception of reality's constant change. The critique of language as an inadequate means of capturing the real does not imply vulgar irrationalism. Laozi is not rejecting thought, but placing it in its rightful place. Discursive thinking is useful, but limited. Wisdom begins when we recognize the limits of thought and accept the silence where it fails. The Tao is not a concept to be mastered, but a presence to be intuited. The Japanese Zen master Dogen, influenced by Taoism and Buddhism, said, "Study the path, forget the path. The true path is without a path." This paradox expresses the same idea. When we seek the absolute, through words we move away from it. But when we empty ourselves of the desire to name, the Tao flows through us, like wind through bamboo. Reality does not need to be told to be lived. However, the human desire to know, to understand, to control remains. Taoism does not deny this impulse, but proposes an opposite movement, not knowing as ignorance, but as openness, not understanding as control, but as listening. Giving up the need to know everything is the beginning of true wisdom. Laozi states, "He who knows does not speak, he who speaks does not know," not as a rigid rule, but as a warning. The deep truth does not shout, it whispers in silence. This silence in Taoism is not emptiness, it is a formless fullness. It's like the space inside a bowl, invisible but indispensable. The Tao is, compared to water, it penetrates everything without resistance. adapts to everything without losing its essence. Language, on the other hand, hardens. It creates boundaries, fixes images. And that is why all language is inadequate for the Tao. Not because it is wrong, but because it is always secondary. Living according to the Tao, then, is accepting that there are no definitive truths. It is moving with the world, not against it. It is acting with gentleness, speaking sparingly, listening more than asserting. Wisdom is not in the accumulation of words, but in the ability to let go of words when they no longer serve. The Tao cannot be told, but it can be lived. If these reflections are stirring something in you, questions, curiosity, or even productive discomfort, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. If you think rationally, living is a burden greater than its reward. Arthur Schopenhauer did not hesitate to state that, from a rational perspective, human life is a negative equation. Life is a business that does not cover its costs, expresses, in economic language, the existential structure of frustration, pain, and suffering that, according to him, compose the human experience at its core. To live, for Schopenhauer, is to enter into an endeavor where the expenses, pain, boredom, struggle, deprivation, far outweigh any profit that can be called pleasure, security, or happiness. This view is not the result of mere cynicism or misanthropy. It comes from a metaphysical analysis of being, centered on the concept of will as the essence of the world. In The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer proposes that the ultimate reality is neither reason nor spirit, nor matter, but an irrational and blind force, the will to live, Wille zum Leben. This will, present in everything that exists, from minerals to humans, is the blind impulse to continue being, to persevere, to desire, to affirm oneself indefinitely. In humans, this will manifests as constant desire, incessant need, and permanent restlessness. What moves life is not reason, but lack. We are always in need of something: food, pleasure, approval, love, peace. And every time a desire is satisfied, we do not achieve fulfillment, but only a break between two dissatisfactions. Pleasure is merely the brief suspension of pain, and soon it gives way to new desires. Thus, to live is to desire, and to desire is to suffer, because desire is lack and lack is pain. Even moments of pleasure, when they occur, are not lasting states. They are fleeting, fragile, and often followed by disappointment or regret. According to Schopenhauer, suffering is the most constant state of existence. If we measure life by its pains, by the amount of losses, diseases, anxieties, tragedies, and frustrations it imposes, we will see that the scale does not balance. The profit is illusory. It is no surprise that Schopenhauer compares life to the pendulum that swings between pain and boredom. Pain is what we feel when we are deprived of what we want. Boredom is what we feel when we already have something. But the will, which cannot rest, demands more. Tranquility is unstable. Happiness is a constantly postponed ideal. And even moments of apparent well-being carry the shadow of loss and impermanence. This view is reinforced by empirical observation itself. Just consider how many lives are marked by misery, conflict, painful aging, loneliness, unfulfilled love, bankruptcy, injustice, and humiliation. Even the most successful biographies by the world's standards are not free from intimate suffering, disease, or moral worries. Life, even when beautiful, is fragile, fleeting, and inevitably ends in death. Schopenhauer does not deny that there are moments of joy or beauty, but for him, these moments are brief exceptions within a greater process of wear and tear. The very awareness of time and death causes human beings to live under a constant shadow. We are the only animals that know we are going to die. And this awareness turns even happiness into something anxious, transient, threatened. Death is the great negative balance that cancels out any apparent gain. This evaluation extends to the collective level as well. Human history, for Schopenhauer, is not a march toward progress or redemption, but a cyclical succession of wars, injustices, and self-destruction. Selfishness rules behavior, cruelty is common, and reason, often celebrated as the supreme human gift, is used to multiply suffering through more efficient wars, more systematic exploitation, or more sophisticated self-deception. Nature itself is blind and indifferent. There is no moral purpose in creation, no universal plan of justice. The innocent suffer, the guilty triumph, and the universe remains indifferent. This makes Schopenhauer not just a pessimistic thinker, but one of the most coherent philosophers of the tragic. He does not seek to console, he seeks to unmask. However, this bitter clarity does not lead to pure nihilism. Schopenhauer offers two possible paths for those who recognize life's negative nature: art and renunciation. In art, especially in music, which he considers the purest form of artistic expression, the individual can momentarily suspend the will by contemplating beauty without desiring to possess it, by losing oneself in a symphony without thinking about utility. The individual transcends their volitional condition. In that moment, there is a kind of silent ecstasy, a forgetting of oneself, that alleviates the weight of desire. But this suspension is brief. The true antidote to suffering, according to Schopenhauer, is the renunciation of the will to live. Inspired by Eastern asceticism, particularly Buddhism and Hinduism, Schopenhauer sees renunciation, stillness, and suppression of desire as the only path to a less painful life. It is not suicide, which he condemns as still an expression of the will, but a progressive detachment, an inner silence that ceases wanting. This ideal of renunciation manifests in the sage, the mystic, the ascetic, the one who, upon understanding that life is a deficit business, abandons the game, not out of despair but out of wisdom. The pleasure this individual seeks is no longer that of sensory satisfaction, but that of freedom from the cycle of wanting and suffering. He does not fight against life, but transcends it. Thus, when Schopenhauer says that life does not cover its costs, he is not just lamenting. He is precisely diagnosing a truth that many avoid confronting. Living requires a constant investment of energy, effort, and pain, and the return is always unstable, discontinuous, and perishable. Reason, when used rigorously, does not offer comforting justifications. It only offers the courage to see, and perhaps the courage to renounce. Every decision shapes who you are. Not choosing is also a choice. In Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialist philosophy, freedom is not an accidental attribute of human beings, but its very definition. For Sartre, humans are not what they are, but what they make of themselves. This means that there is no essence before existence. The individual is free, radically free. And because of this, they are condemned to choose. It is within this structure that one of his most powerful statements arises. Choosing is always choosing oneself. This idea directly connects to Sartre's central thesis: existence precedes essence. Unlike manufactured objects, whose essence, that is, their purpose, definition, and structure, precedes their existence, a knife is designed before it is made. Human beings do not come with a fixed nature or predetermined purpose. The individual exists first, and only later, through choice and action, builds their essence, that is, defines who they are. When Sartre says that in choosing, we are choosing ourselves, he means that every decision carries an ontological and moral value. We do not just choose an action, we choose a way of being. Each time we act, we affirm, "This is who I am." Even in small or everyday decisions, we are expressing an image of who we want to be, choosing between speaking or staying silent, acting or holding back, facing something or avoiding it. All of these reveal, build, and reinforce aspects of how we exist. This perspective completely rejects the idea of a fixed or determined human nature. Who I am is not given in advance. There is, for Sartre, no hidden inner essence waiting to be discovered. The self is not a pre-existing content, but a project in constant creation. And this project is realized through freedom. We are free to be what we choose, and this freedom is not occasional, but structural. Many would like to escape this weight. And it is precisely at this point that Sartre introduces the concept of bad faith, mauvaise foi, a form of self-deception where the individual denies their freedom, pretending to be a fixed thing or role. A classic example is the waiter who acts as if he is only a waiter, reducing himself to his functional and social role. By doing so, he avoids the responsibility of being more than that. He avoids choosing other possibilities for himself. But avoiding choice is also a choice. Omission is not neutral. Apathy is an act. Escaping is a decision. For Sartre, there is no space outside of choice. Even the act of surrendering to automatism, following the crowd, repeating familiar or social patterns, all of this is a way of choosing to be someone who delegates their being to external factors. Freedom can be denied in consciousness, but never in its operation. Not choosing is still choosing to be someone who avoids. This makes human life a continuous process of self-constitution. Every moment offers the opportunity and the responsibility to shape who we are, and there are no excuses. Sartre rejects any form of psychological, social, or biological determinism as a totalizing justification. Of course, there are conditions and limits, but even within them, the human being is responsible for how they respond to their situation. We are not free to do everything, but we are always free to position ourselves in response to what happens to us. However, this freedom does not come without anguish. Sartre writes that the human being is condemned to be free because they cannot escape the fact that they must decide. There is no higher authority telling them what to do. There is no nature to follow, no God to obey, no absolute values to serve as fixed guides. The human being is alone in the world and must, from themselves, give shape to their own existence. This is why choice is always double-edged. In choosing an action, we also choose a way of being. By lying, for example, the person does not just perform an isolated act. They choose to be someone who can lie, someone who allows themselves to deceive. By forgiving, they choose to be someone who recognizes fallibility and is willing to rebuild connections. The act defines who we are, and over time, these acts shape character, identity, and destiny. There is no escape. This view eliminates ethical neutrality. Every act projects itself into the world as a statement of value. Sartre insists that, by choosing for oneself, one chooses for everyone. This does not mean imposing one's choice on others, but that each choice involves an implicit judgment about what is considered valuable. In acting, we affirm, this way of life is preferable, valid, human. For this reason, freedom is always accompanied by responsibility. Authenticity arises when the individual recognizes this structure and fully assumes it. The authentic individual does not seek excuses, does not outsource their identity, and does not hide behind masks. They understand that, at every moment, they are the author of themselves. And this authorship is not a completed task, but an ongoing project. Existence is not a given, but a construction. This ethics of personal choice demands constant vigilance. In the contemporary world, there are 1,000 ways to escape. Totalizing ideologies, automatic consumption, the performance of social roles. Sartre's existentialism calls us back to the core of freedom. Every choice is a revelation of who you are and who you choose to be. There is no neutrality, no essence to fulfill, no excuse to absolve. By stating that choosing is always choosing oneself, Sartre dismantles the idea that human decisions are separate from identity. What I do, what I don't do, what I accept, what I refuse. All of this is my biography being written in real time, and it is impossible to live without writing that story. The question is, do you write it consciously or let others write it for you? We seek meaning in a universe that does not respond to us. That is the absurd. Albert Camus does not start his philosophy by asking if God exists or what the foundation of morality is. He begins with a more urgent and visceral question. Is suicide the only truly serious philosophical question? With this provocation, at the beginning of the myth of Sisyphus, he brings the focus to the heart of his reflection, the absurd. The absurd, for Camus, is not an abstract theory. It is a direct, everyday, intimate existential experience. It arises when a human being faces the lack of inherent meaning in the world and, at the same time, refuses to accept this lack as a sufficient reason to give up on life. The phrase, "the absurd," is born from this confrontation between the human call and the irrational silence of the world encapsulates this experience. On one side, there is the human desire for meaning, clarity, justice, and permanence. We want to understand why we exist, the purpose of our pain, the fate of our actions. We seek moral order, logic, and an ultimate goal. On the other side, there is the world, mute, indifferent, cold, without answers. The universe offers no justification. The stars do not speak. Nature continues its course without caring about our questions. This contrast, this friction between desire and reality, is what Camus calls the absurd. It is not that the world itself is absurd, nor that the human being is absurd for wanting meaning. The absurd is in the relationship between the two, in the clash between the longing for explanation and the absence of any transcendental answer. As Camus writes, the absurd depends as much on man as it does on the world. It is therefore a tension, not a property of reality, but a state of consciousness. Camus describes the moment when this state reveals itself. It can happen in a banal instant, the mechanical repetition of routine, the strangeness of looking at one's own image in the mirror, the loss of a loved one, the awareness of inevitable death. Suddenly, the veil is torn, and what once seemed natural reveals itself as devoid of guarantees. Life, with its repetitions and conventions, becomes a riddle without a solution. The question echoes, why? And there is no answer. In the face of this, three possibilities arise. The first is suicide, physical renunciation. The second is philosophical suicide, which consists of taking refuge in some form of metaphysical belief, accepting an unprovable higher truth, such as God, absolute reason, or fate. The third is the only one Camus considers faithful to the experience of the absurd, recognizing the absurd and living with it, without denying it. This attitude requires courage and clarity. The absurd person is one who, even in the face of meaninglessness, refuses to surrender to the denial of life. They do not seek external salvation, do not give in to comforting doctrines, and do not close their eyes. On the contrary, they embrace the void, face the silence, and find in this confrontation a tragic form of freedom. For if life has no prior meaning, then the meaning it has will depend on each person. The central image of this stance is the myth of Sisyphus, who, condemned by the gods to eternally push a rock uphill only to watch it roll back down, becomes, for Camus, the symbol of the absurd person. His task is futile, endless, without an ultimate purpose. But it is precisely by accepting this futility, by refusing to revolt against it with despair or self-deception, that Sisyphus becomes great. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. Happy, not by denying the absurd, but by fully embracing it. Because, by embracing the absurd, the human being frees themselves from illusions, vain hopes, and metaphysical promises that paralyze action. They become the master of the moment. If the future is not guaranteed by any destiny, then each moment is valuable in itself. There is no after that redeems the present, and for that very reason, the present becomes more precious. This ethics of the absurd transforms existence. It is not resignation, but a lucid revolt. The absurd person is not a nihilist. They do not say that nothing matters. On the contrary, they create value in the absence of pre-established meaning. Their life becomes a work of art, not a narrative, with morals or a happy ending, but a continuous affirmation of freedom in the face of emptiness. Camus also develops this idea in The Rebel, where he expands the notion of absurdity to the political and historical plane. The rebel is the one who, in the face of the world's injustice, says no, but a no that affirms a limit, a dignity, a fidelity to what is human. Not because history has meaning, but because the absence of meaning does not justify anything. Freedom, in this context, becomes ethical, to act, even knowing the universe is indifferent. This philosophy offers no comfort, but it offers consistency. It does not promise happiness, but a form of greatness. Camus does not say life is good. He says it is absurd, and that even so, it is worth living with clarity, passion, and responsibility. He writes, "The absurd does not liberate, it obliges. It does not authorize all actions. Everything is permitted does not mean that nothing has value. Therefore, the experience of the absurd is the moment when the human being awakens from the illusion of the absolute. It is a shock, a vertigo, an emptiness, but also a chance. For by knowing that the world does not respond, the human being discovers that they themselves are the voice. And by living without the promise of eternity, they find in the present the only possible eternity. The source of suffering lies in attachment to what is unstable by nature. At the heart of Buddhist teachings, we find a fundamental observation about the nature of human experience. All suffering arises from attachment. In his first noble truth, dukkha, the Buddha states that life is inherently unsatisfactory. But it is in the second noble truth that he identifies the origin of this dissatisfaction: desire, longing, attachment. The term in Pali is tanha, thirst, and it is closely linked to the compulsive desire for existence, pleasure, and identity. When this thirst solidifies, it becomes attachment, upadana, the attempt to fix what, by its very nature, cannot be fixed. Cling and you will suffer summarizes this view accurately. Suffering is not a punishment, nor a fatality, nor the result of random external forces. It is a direct effect of attachment to what is impermanent, fleeting, and unstable. And everything in conditioned existence, that is, everything that is born, changes, and dies, is impermanent. This includes the body, emotions, thoughts, material possessions, relationships, and even the idea we have of self. The structure of suffering reveals itself in the following dynamic. We want pleasure to last, love to remain unchanged, the body to stay young, happy moments to repeat. But inevitably, everything changes. The object of our desire transforms, moves away, or disappears. And the more the mind clings to it, the more it identifies with it, expects it, and demands it, the more intense the pain will be when impermanence takes its course. Attachment arises from the illusion of permanence. Out of ignorance, avidya, we believe that things can satisfy us in a stable way. We seek security in something that, by definition, cannot give us that security. It's like trying to build a house on sand, and when life's instability manifests through loss, illness, rejection, death, we react with frustration, fear, anger, or sadness. The mind refuses to accept that nothing is guaranteed. This is the trap of attachment. It promises happiness, but delivers suffering. The pleasure of possession soon turns into anxiety about maintaining it. The joy of love soon mixes with the fear of loss. Achievement quickly turns into worry. Everything we hold on to becomes a burden. And the paradox is that the more we try to fix the world, the more we suffer from its fluidity. For the Buddha, there is no escape from suffering without letting go of attachment. This does not mean rejecting life, but reconsidering how we relate to it. The problem is not with things themselves, but with the dependence we create on them to feel complete. The key is to develop detachment, not as indifference or coldness, but as wisdom, the direct understanding that everything is impermanent and therefore cannot be owned. In Buddhist practice, this becomes evident in meditation. By observing the sensations, thoughts, and emotions that arise and disappear, the practitioner begins to realize that there is nothing fixed to hold onto. Everything changes, constantly. The body breathes, pulses, ages. The mind thinks, stirs, calms. The self that feels pleasure today is no longer recognizable tomorrow. When this is clearly seen, the mind begins to let go. This letting go is liberating. By no longer depending on external conditions to feel at peace, the individual discovers a new way of living with fewer expectations, fewer demands, and less suffering. Detachment does not eliminate love, but purifies it. It makes it more generous, less possessive. Detachment does not deny pain, but prevents it from turning into despair. It teaches us to live with an open heart, knowing that everything passes, but that this does not prevent us from being present. The Buddha compares attachment to a hand holding a burning coal. The one who holds it gets burned. And still, it's common for us to keep holding on, even while feeling the pain, because we believe that this coal is all we have. But by letting go, by releasing the compulsion to control, to hold, to possess, an inner space opens up. A space of freedom, serenity, and compassion. That's why Buddhism values mindfulness practice, sati, so highly, because we can only abandon attachment if we recognize when it arises. Attachment is not always obvious. It can disguise itself as care, legitimate desire, or commitment. But when observed with clarity, we see that there is always tension, fear, an attempt to fix what cannot be fixed. There's also attachment to identity. This is perhaps the most subtle and profound. The idea that we are a fixed person, with a stable personality, with a definitive history, all of this is a source of suffering. We defend this self with everything we have, and we suffer whenever it is threatened, criticized, or ignored. The Buddha teaches that this self is also impermanent, a set of processes in flux. By clinging to it, we suffer with everything that contradicts it. Thus, the path to liberation involves understanding that suffering is optional. The pain of change, loss, aging is inevitable, but the suffering that arises from attachment, that can be dissolved. And this does not require miracles or promises, but a continuous practice of seeing things as they truly are, without illusions, seeing what is, instead of projecting what we want it to be. This view is not cold, but compassionate. Because when we realize that everyone suffers because they cling, the practitioner develops karuna, active compassion. They understand that everyone seeks security, permanence, love, but does so on unstable foundations. And understanding this, the heart opens, not to judge, but to embrace. The wisdom of detachment paradoxically leads to a freer love and a deeper peace. If these reflections are awakening something in you, questions, curiosity, or even productive discomfort, take this opportunity to subscribe to the channel. There is no rational certainty, only the leap, the risk, the paradox. For Søren Kierkegaard, faith is not reached through reason. You don't prove God as you would prove a theorem. You don't walk toward belief through syllogisms. Faith, he says, begins precisely where thought ends. It is at the boundary of reason, where it recognizes its own limitations, that the individual faces a radical choice, either leap into the dark or remain on the edge of true existence. For Kierkegaard, faith is not a comforting conviction or a cultural inheritance. It is a distressing, individual, and incommunicable experience. It involves a leap over the abyss of doubt, And this leap is existential, not logical. The Danish philosopher is not concerned with defending dogmas or proving doctrines. His central concern is what it means to believe in God in a world where no proof is possible. And yet, where that faith can be the path to the realization of being. Thought, however powerful, is limited. It can analyze, compare, describe, and question. But it cannot establish the ultimate meaning of existence. It can demonstrate the structure of an argument, but cannot justify why we live. Kierkegaard sees this clearly. Influenced by the spiritual crisis of modernity and the growing skepticism of 19th century Europe, he states that reason is incapable of offering definitive answers about meaning, the self, or God. This is where the concept of paradox emerges. For Kierkegaard, true Christianity, the kind that requires genuine faith, is not the Christianity of bourgeois morality or the official doctrines of the churches. It is the Christianity that presents the paradox of God becoming man, dying, and inviting the believer to accept this scandal without proof. Faith does not oppose reason because it is irrational, but because it is supra-rational. It does not contradict logic, it transcends it. The most well-known example of this paradox is found in the story of Abraham, as presented in Fear and Trembling. Abraham is commanded by God to sacrifice his son, Isaac, the son of promise, the son of the impossible, the one he had waited for decades. The command is absurd. It goes against morality, reason, and even human feeling. And yet, Abraham obeys, he believes, and he believes despite the absurdity. This is the essence of what Kierkegaard calls the leap of faith. Abraham doesn't understand, doesn't explain, doesn't justify. He acts, he leaps. And it is in this leap that authentic faith is revealed, not a belief based on evidence, but an absolute trust in the face of impossibility. Faith, therefore, is the acceptance of a lived paradox. It is saying yes, where reason can only find no. This does not mean that faith dispenses with thought. On the contrary, the true believer needs reason until its limit. He does not ignore objections, avoid questions, or reduce complexity. But when he reaches the point where thought cannot go further, where mystery remains, he chooses to believe. And this choice is not guaranteed by any certainty. It is free. It is risk. That is why Kierkegaard says that faith requires anguish. Faith is not easy peace. It is not emotional stability. It is conflict, tension, the struggle with God in the dark night of the soul. The one who truly believes is suspended between the visible world, ordered by logic, and the invisible, which imposes itself as an absolute demand. Believing is, therefore, exposing oneself to the absence of guarantees. It is living without security and still remaining firm. This structure makes faith similar to the tragic aesthetic. But unlike Greek tragedy, where the hero succumbs to fate, in Kierkegaard's Christianity, the believer triumphs by believing in the impossible. Not because the impossible becomes logical, but because fidelity to the paradox transforms the individual. The leap of faith is above all an act of existential freedom. It doesn't resolve the paradox, but affirms that living is accepting this paradox as the condition of being. Kierkegaard's philosophy, therefore, is not a defense of traditional religious faith, but a critique of easy, inherited, automated faith. The true believer, for him, is the one who suffers through faith, who lives it as anguish, who knows it is not rationally sustainable, and who, even so, chooses to sustain it. Faith is movement, not conclusion. It is a living relationship with the mystery, not adherence to a theory. This understanding of faith as a leap also has an ethical dimension. The one who believes, in Kierkegaard's view, does not seek external validation. He moves in radical isolation, like Abraham. His commitment to the absolute puts him in tension with the world, with common morality, with common sense. He acts in obedience to an inner relationship with the transcendent, and this action may appear as madness to others, but that is where faith lies. in the courage to live the truth that no one can prove for you. This is the point at which Kierkegaard deeply diverges from totalizing philosophical systems, such as Hegelianism, which try to explain everything through historical reason. For him, existential truth is not universal, but personal. The knight of faith is not a collective hero, but a singular individual before God. Subjectivity, far from being weakness, is the field where truth is incarnated. Truth is subjectivity, he writes, and faith is the highest act of that, subjectivity before the infinite. Therefore, when Kierkegaard says that faith begins where thought ends, he is describing a liminal experience. It's not about opposing faith and reason as enemies, but recognizing that thought takes us to the edge, and that only a leap can cross the abyss that separates us from eternity. This leap is not irrational, it is supra-rational, and only those who have had the courage to think to the end can leap authentically. Accepting that the world is indifferent is the first step toward true freedom. Albert Camus built his philosophy from a breaking point, the absence of meaning in the universe. For him, human beings live as creatures thrown into a world that offers no answers to their most essential questions. We seek reason, clarity, justice, and coherence, and find silence. This fracture between the desire for meaning and the indifference of the world is what Camus called the absurd. And it is by recognizing this condition, without trying to deny it or cover it up with illusions, that a human being takes the first step toward authentic freedom. Unlike those who see the absurd as a dead end, Camus views it as a starting point. The realization that the world has no inherent moral logic, that destiny is not ruled by justice, and that existence is not guided by any higher purpose may, at first, cause vertigo. But it is precisely at this moment that a new possibility opens up, the chance to live without lies, to live without resorting to God, fate, future rewards, or absolute justifications, to live with the courage to embrace the nakedness of existence. This recognition is not a theoretical gesture, it is an existential attitude. The individual does not simply acknowledge that the universe is indifferent. He accepts this indifference without submitting to it. He does not despair, does not fall into nihilism, but affirms his freedom in the face of the absurd. And this is what transforms the awareness of the absurd into a creative force. Camus writes in The Myth of Sisyphus, "The first step of the spirit is to recognize that this world is strange. Strange here doesn't mean hostile. It means indifferent to our desires and categories. The world simply is. It was not made for us. It does not respond to our requests. It has no script with guarantees of meaning. But this does not condemn us to passivity. On the contrary, it frees us. For if the universe is indifferent, it is up to us to choose what to do with the freedom that this indifference gives us. From the recognition of the absurd, the freedom to create arises. Since there is no given fate, we are free to construct the meaning of life, not theoretically, but practically through the actions, commitments, and choices we make. The absurd human being is one who does not seek comfort, but presence. He does not look for a final answer, but lives as if life had meaning, even though it does not offer it in itself. This freedom is not the freedom to do whatever you want in a whimsical sense. It is the freedom to be true to clarity, true to the absence of guarantees, true to the fact that no transcendence will come to justify our actions. Therefore, each action requires radical responsibility. Each gesture, each choice, each word becomes a creative act of value because it is not supported by any external foundation. In this context, freedom is inseparable from responsibility. Camus develops this idea in The Rebel. The rebel is the one who, upon recognizing that the world is absurd, does not resign. He does not accept injustice, does not bow to oppression, does not become cynical. On the contrary, he affirms a value, human dignity, without needing a metaphysical justification. He says no to the absurd, but a no that contains a yes. the yes to freedom, solidarity, and resistance. It is in this tension that freedom becomes authentic, for it is not inherited nor revealed, it is earned. The freedom that Camus speaks of is not a right granted by a higher order. It is a task assumed by the one who, upon recognizing the void, chooses to fill it with presence. The absurd man is free because he expects nothing more. And precisely because he expects nothing, he can act with more strength, more courage, and more compassion. This type of freedom is rare because it requires inner strength. It requires living without illusions, without appeals to eternity, without certainty that good will triumph or that history will have a redeeming end. But it is this very absence of guarantees that makes freedom so precious. Camus writes, "To live is the opposite of waiting. That is, to live freely is to not postpone existence in the name of future rewards. It is to act here and now, with everything we have, and nothing more." This recognition of the absurd as the foundation of freedom also involves a revision of the concept of revolution. Camus criticizes both total nihilism and ideologies that in the name of an absolute future justify present violence. He sees these systems as a denial of the absurd, an attempt to force meaning onto the world through imposition. For him, freedom begins when we renounce the temptation of totality and accept that reality is fragmented, contradictory, and unfinished. The free man, then, is the one who moves between the absurd and action. He knows that no cause is absolute, but he also knows that this does not exempt him from acting with integrity. His freedom is not above life, but immersed in it. It is the freedom to love, knowing that everything passes, to create knowing that everything will be forgotten, to fight, knowing that no victory is final. This is tragic freedom, and, for that reason, more human. By accepting that the world is indifferent, man frees himself from dependence on the absolute. He no longer needs a final answer to justify his existence. He no longer expects life to make sense. He gives meaning to life through his way of being in the world. This does not eliminate pain, doubt, or fatigue, but it offers something rarer: the dignity of existing with awareness. Camus ends the myth of Sisyphus with the image of the hero condemned to eternally push his stone up the mountain. There is no redemption, no glory, no end. But Sisyphus, by becoming aware of the absurdity of his task, claims his inner freedom. He does not deceive himself, does not wait, does not delude himself. He acts, and it is this action, lucid and without illusions, that makes him free. The struggle to reach the summit is enough to fill a man's heart. What we call the self is a constantly changing aggregate, without a fixed essence. One of the most challenging and profound teachings in Buddhism is the absence of an essential self, known in the Pali tradition as anatta, or anatman in Sanskrit. This principle asserts that nowhere in experience can we identify a permanent, unchanging, substantial self. What we usually call the self, our identity, our personality, our soul, our essence, is in fact a construction made up of unstable, interdependent, and constantly changing elements. Saying that the self is an illusion doesn't mean denying the reality of subjective experience. Buddhism doesn't deny that we feel, think, act, and recognize ourselves as individuals. But it affirms that this individuality is empty of fixed substance. It is composed, according to the Buddha, of 5 aggregates, panchakanda: form, the physical body; sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. These 5 elements make up what we call the human being. However, none of them are permanent, and more importantly, none of them are a self. The body changes, sensations come and go, perceptions alternate, mental formations, such as desires, fears, habits, transform over time. Consciousness, although continuous, is momentary and conditioned. If we examine each of these aggregates attentively, we'll see that there is no stable core, no essential center. And yet, We build a narrative that unifies all of this under the label of self. The origin of this illusion lies in ignorance, avidya, the root of suffering, according to the Four Noble Truths. Through ignorance, we believe that there is something in us that is fixed, reliable, and controllable. But everyday experience disproves this. Our thoughts escape control. Our mood fluctuates without warning. Our desires contradict us. We age, get sick, lose memories, change our opinions. What is constant in this process? The belief in a permanent self, according to Buddhism, is one of the main sources of suffering. When we think there is a solid self, we begin to protect, defend, and preserve this fictional entity. We feel pride, envy, shame, fear, all in relation to the image we have of ourselves. We struggle to maintain consistency, to sustain an identity, to be someone. But how can we sustain something that deep down has no fixed foundation? The more we try to fix the self, the more we suffer from its instability. The teaching of anatta is profoundly liberating. It doesn't aim to destroy individuality, but to empty the illusion of the ego as a separate, substantial entity. By realizing that the self is just a name given to a continuous process of arising and passing away of mental and physical phenomena, the practitioner opens up to a new way of existing, less rigid, less possessive, more compassionate. In meditation, this view can be directly experienced. When one observes the mind with mindfulness, sati, one realizes that thoughts arise on their own, not created by an agent. Bodily sensations come and go. Emotions appear, manifest, and cease. And at no point is it possible to find a fixed self behind these phenomena. There is experience, but no separate experiencer. This realization doesn't lead to indifference, but to wisdom. For by understanding that there is no separate, permanent self, the practitioner also understands that others are also flowing processes, interdependent. Their suffering is like ours. Fear, anger, attachment, they are universal phenomena. Thus, active compassion, karuna, arises not as a moral duty, but as a natural expression of a mind that sees clearly. Understanding the non-self also dissolves the fear of death. For if there is no permanent self now, what exactly will die? Death is simply the cessation of a composed process, like the flame of a candle going out. Consciousness does not need an eternal self to be meaningful. The value of life is not in guaranteeing immortality, but in fully living the present moment without attachment to what we think we are. This teaching also strongly contrasts with Western philosophies focused on identity, individuality, and the permanence of the subject. While much of Western metaphysics tries to ground the identity of the self, whether in the soul, reason, or will, Buddhism offers a radical critique of the very concept of a fixed identity. The self is a useful illusion, a functional construction, but it is not an ultimate reality. The idea that the self is an illusion should not be confused with nihilism. Buddhism does not deny the relative existence of the self. It only asserts that it is not absolute, not separate, not permanent. This distinction is essential. The practitioner still speaks, acts, feels, and thinks, but does not take these activities as expressions of an essential self. They are simply interconnected events, conditioned, empty of substantiality. The wisdom of anatta invites, therefore, a deeper type of detachment, not just from things, but from oneself. By letting go of the fixation on the self, an unexpected freedom arises, the freedom of not being anyone in particular, the freedom of not having to maintain masks, the freedom to act without being trapped in rigid roles. The self becomes light, fluid, open, a space where the world can happen. As the Japanese Zen master Dogen said, studying the path is studying the self. Studying the self is forgetting the self. Forgetting the self is being enlightened by the 10,000 things, that is, by By realizing that the self is empty, space opens up for the full presence of the world, others, and reality as it is. If these reflections are awakening something in you, questions, curiosity, or even productive discomfort, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. Authentic existence is never static. It requires rupture, crisis, and constant renewal. In Karl Jasper's philosophy, consciousness is not a fixed entity, nor a stable point of observation, but a dynamic process of continuous transformation. Saying that consciousness is a becoming means recognizing that it is not something finished, not final, and it doesn't have a definitive form. On the contrary, it is built in motion, in crises, ruptures, and confrontations with the limits of existence. True consciousness for Jaspers is not a state, it is a path, and this path is never straight or calm. It is marked by disorientation, doubt, conflict, and above all, transcendence. To understand this concept, we must place Jaspers within the existentialist tradition. Unlike other thinkers such as Sartre or Heidegger, Jaspers links human existence to both a philosophical and spiritual axis. He proposes that there are different levels of consciousness, and that most people live in a superficial consciousness, directed toward the empirical world, the everyday, and the functional. This is the objective consciousness, which organizes the world through science, language, and social norms. But this consciousness, while useful, does not touch the depth of being. Authentic consciousness, the one that recognizes itself as a becoming, only emerges in limit situations. Gren's situation, a central concept in Jasper's work. Limit situations are those that place the individual in front of something that cannot be avoided or resolved. Death, suffering, guilt, failure, and finitude. In these experiences, ordinary consciousness collapses. The usual thought patterns fail. There are no more guarantees, answers, or control. It is then that the possibility of a deeper consciousness arises. Existential consciousness. This new consciousness does not arise from the accumulation of knowledge, but from an internal collapse that requires reconfiguration. The human being, when confronted with the limit, feels lost, fragmented. But it is in this rupture that something new can emerge, a new beginning. The becoming of consciousness is therefore a process of creative crisis. It is in the failure of the previous structure that the opening to a deeper meaning reveals itself, not given, but constructed. Jaspers calls this experience existential enlightenment. It is not a divine revelation in the traditional religious sense, but an inner clarity that arises when existence is faced in its radical nature. Consciousness transforms not through the addition of new certainties, but through the lucid acceptance of uncertainty. It realizes its own condition, that it has no fixed essence, that it is always in formation, that it is a constant becoming. Authentic existence in this context is not stability, but movement. And this movement requires openness to what Jaspers calls transcendence, not in the sense of a dogmatically defined God, but as that which transcends the limits of knowledge and objectivity. Consciousness that knows itself as becoming recognizes that there is something beyond what can be said, thought, or measured. It is not a blind belief, but a philosophical attitude of humility and search. This impulse toward transcendence is, for Jaspers, inherent to the human condition. He calls us beings in path, Dasein transforming into existenz. The transition between these two forms of being is what characterizes authentic existence. In the state of Dasein, the individual is tied to the immediate world, seeking comfort, security, recognition. In existenz, the human being becomes aware of their freedom, their responsibility, and the absence of external guarantees. They become the author of themselves, but without a stable foundation, without essence, only as a process. Consciousness, in this framework, is a field of tension. It does not settle in peace, but confronts the paradox of existence. It seeks meaning, but does not find it given. It desires permanence, but lives in impermanence. It searches for clarity, but dives into mystery. And yet it continues seeking, choosing, acting. This continuation is the becoming of consciousness, not as repetition, but as radical transformation. The value of this conception lies in its recognition of the human being as an open project. Nothing is predetermined. There is no essence to fulfill, no destiny to obey. Identity is not a destination, but a continuous task, and this task is existentially demanding, as it involves accepting one's own incompleteness. Jaspers insists that truth is not something one possesses, it is something one lives, and living the truth demands authenticity. Authenticity here is not about being true to yourself in the psychological sense, but about being true to the highest possibility of existence. It is living with the awareness that every choice shapes being, that every crisis can open space for a new form of presence, that there is no rest, but there is meaning in the very movement. This view has ethical implications. Consciousness that recognizes itself as becoming does not settle for easy truths, nor does it hide behind external norms. It questions, ruptures, expands. And above all, it recognizes the other as an essential part of its process. For Jaspers, authentic communication between consciousnesses is one of the deepest forms of transcendence. When two consciousnesses meet in truth without masks, without control, both transform. The becoming of consciousness is, therefore, also a becoming with the other. Jasper's philosophy invites human beings to live with lucidity in the face of instability, pain, and finitude, not as tragedy, but as a call. Consciousness only truly becomes alive when it accepts not to be something finished. It is a crossing, and, like every crossing, it involves risks, losses, and new beginnings. But it is in this process that the deepest dignity of being is revealed. To be unfinished and still be capable of seeking. Don't turn truths into dogmas. Even enlightenment can become a prison. The phrase, "if you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha," attributed to the Chinese Zen master Linji Yixuan, Rinzai Gigan in Japanese, is one of the most radical and provocative expressions in Zen thought. At first glance, it seems blasphemous or absurd. How can a Buddhist master urge his disciples to kill the Buddha, the central figure of the spiritual path? However, this paradoxical statement deeply reveals the essence of Zen, the refusal of any attachment, even to the path itself. In Zen, enlightenment is not an absolute endpoint. It is, first and foremost, a liberation from illusion. But the paradox is that even the idea of enlightenment can become a new illusion. A practitioner who clings to the image of the Buddha as an idealized symbol, as an untouchable figure, as the other absolute, risks getting lost in worship, imitation, and dependence. Zen, in its purity, is a school of radical liberation. When Linji says, "kill the Buddha," he is not attacking the historical figure of Siddhartha Gautama, nor rejecting the value of his teachings. Rather, he is pointing to the danger of fixing anything as the final truth. Zen sees the human mind as deeply prone to attachment, not only to pleasure, power, or the ego, but also to the sacred, to doctrine, to mystical experience. Therefore, even enlightenment, when conceptualized, can become a prison. This teaching has deep roots in the heart of Mahayana Buddhism, which teaches to overcome all concepts, even the most sublime. As the heart of wisdom, Prajnaparamita, Hridaya Sutra, says, "Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Every form is transient, every concept is relative. The path cannot be reduced to fixed formulas. When one tries to grasp truth, it slips away. When one makes it an idol, it becomes an obstacle." Zen, especially in its Rinzai form, values the breaking of expectations and certainties. Its masters use paradoxes, shouting, unexpected actions, and even physical blows to awaken students from conceptual sleep. Enlightenment, in Zen, is not an extraordinary state reached after years of rational study. It is the sudden break from the dualistic mind, which separates, categorizes, and explains. And for this break to happen, it is necessary to destroy even the mental models of the sacred. If you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha is, therefore, an act of compassion. Linji is telling the disciple, do not cling to the image, not even to the best image. Do not settle for idols, even if those idols are called wisdom, enlightenment, truth, or Buddha. Every attachment is a prison. Every fixation is a deviation. The path is only true when it is lived with inner freedom, and this freedom is only possible when there is nothing left to cling to. This phrase also denounces a common tendency in all religious traditions, the fossilization of teaching. The master teaches liberation, but the disciples turn this teaching into a rigid doctrine. The master points to the moon, and the disciples begin to worship the finger. Zen strongly rejects this. It does not offer ready-made truths, but tools to deconstruct one's own concepts. That's why many Zen masters say, if you meet the Buddha on the way, run. Because any image formed of truth is always partial. The ultimate reality, the Tao, the Dharmakaya, the nature of Buddha, cannot be said, explained, or systematized. All language fails. Any attempt to fix truth in words, rituals, or dogmas results in distancing from direct experience. Zen seeks, above all, the immediate experience of reality, not as something extraordinary, but as what is right in front of us, right now. The present moment is the Buddha. The sound of the wind is the Buddha. The quiet walk is the Buddha. But if we name, label, or worship, we've already moved away. The true encounter with the Buddha is the one that doesn't need the Buddha as an external object. It is the one that happens in the emptiness of a free mind. Linji's instruction, therefore, is an invitation to spiritual autonomy. The Zen practitioner is not a follower in the traditional sense. He is a seeker who needs to burn the maps to find the territory. He must cross the fire of doubt, rupture, and not knowing. He must, as Dogen said, abandon body and mind. Only then, free from everything, can he realize that walking itself was the path. This radicality might seem dangerous, and indeed, Zen is not for those seeking security, certainties, or doctrinal comfort. It is a path of deep deconstruction, but it is not nihilistic. It does not say that nothing matters. It says that it matters so much that we cannot reduce life to what we think about it. Life, the moment, the practice, all of this is so precious that it must be lived without intermediaries. If you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha is, in the end, a warning. Don't make your awakening a prison. Don't make enlightenment a medal. Don't make tradition armor. True spiritual freedom lies beyond names, beyond titles, even beyond the idea of freedom. It is in the gesture without attachment, in the action without ego, in the moment lived with full attention, without anything to defend. The historical Buddha, if he were facing this phrase, would probably smile, for he himself warned, "If you see my teaching as a raft, remember that it is to cross over, not to be carried on your back." Linji just took this logic to the necessary extreme. When you reach the shore, let go of the raft. Philosophy doesn't provide ready-made answers. It teaches us to ask the right questions. And if this video helped you think differently, see more deeply, or simply made you feel you're not alone on this journey, then it was worth it. Like the video, it helps us keep producing content with this purpose. Share it with others who are also on this path of questioning and awareness. And of course, stay here on the channel. There are many more videos that continue this journey, each one opening new doors for thought and being. Thank you for walking with us. See you next time.